Hi, Penny. Can you just confirm that you're on the line, please?
Joined. Yeah, I'm here. I can hear you.
I'm good, thanks. Just give us a few moments and we'll get the rest of folks back on the line, okay?
Joined.
All right. All right, everybody, welcome back to our meeting. We have resolved the technical difficulties to an extent with some creative thinking. So thank you very much to Trustee Liaison Officer Miller for finding a creative solution in order to get us back up and running. And with that, we will resume. Now, we did have Superintendent Torrens providing a presentation. Superintendent, I'll actually have you start from the beginning of your presentation because I believe that all of it was missed. And I am hearing from trustees that the sound is still terrible. Sorry, one moment. So I'm wondering, Bill, do you want to maybe just say your opening lines and then we're just going to monitor how it's being received on the other end? Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. So just to briefly summarize and then move on to what I hadn't covered, we do have 337 homerooms currently in remote learning. Our approximate enrollment as of Friday was 8,700 students. We have worked very hard through the initial startup.
So sorry. It looks like we have not been able to resolve this. So I'm just going to just one moment, please. We are just trying to find another creative solution. So one moment, bear with us, please.
Tracy. Joined.
Do you want me to text the, okay.
welcome back. We have another creative solution, so hopefully this works, and hopefully everyone can hear us through the live stream event as well. Superintendent Torrens, if you could please take it away.
Thank you. And through the chair, we have currently in remote learning, we have 337 homerooms with approximately 8,700 students. Remote learning is dual track, both French immersion and English. The initial startup period in September and October focused on student registration, class building, providing teaching resources, and ensuring adequate levels of support for students with individual education plans and English language learners. This required a high degree of cooperation between remote learning and various service departments within the board. And through the learning and the experience of startup, we came to believe that we needed to enhance support to remote learning and therefore have seconded or put a principal on special assignment to take on a coordinating role within remote learning and secondary e-learning. To facilitate enhanced functionality of the program, we've divided into 3 sub-programs. Full-day kindergarten, French immersion Mandarin is one program. Primary, grades 1 through 3 is the second program, and junior intermediate, grades 4 through 8 is the third program. Each of these programs is led by a principal with the support of vice principals. And to facilitate effective communications, each one will have its own email address and its own board extension to enable parents to contact each division easily and for the response time to be very much faster than it has been in September and October. Just in terms of, or turning to enrollment, we've provided 2 tables to provide a snapshot of how enrollment changed between September 11th, which was our initial organization after we had the extra approximately 2,000 students join us in remote learning, and our projected enrollment for November 3rd. You will notice that enrollment between those times will grow by approximately 219 students across the 3 programs or subdivisions of the program. What's notable in terms of enrollment is that we have found that kindergarten and early primary enrollment has declined, but that has been balanced and exceeded by growth in the later intermediate grades, grades 7 and 8. We have noted in conversation with parents that many parents who have left remote learning have indicated that they felt that their child was not developmentally ready necessarily to take on remote learning, and so they had therefore decided to move to homeschooling until they felt that their child was ready to either return to remote or they felt comfortable returning to the physical classroom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Superintendent Torrens. So we're going to continue on slide 5, section 5, elementary schools, and the subsection on transitions. I'll begin by turning this back over to Director Figueiredo to provide some of the highlights in terms of this extremely challenging time for both staff and students as we embarked on our first transition point following the start of the school year. Director?
Through the chair and to all trustees, I think I captured this at the beginning, but I did want to reiterate that this transitional time will be the most complex and the most challenging. And it's the only time that allows us to do a reorganization. As stated in the report, there were 2,000 plus students after we organized in August that we honored the parent choice to go to remote. Again, we put temporary staff in, knowing that when we got to this point, we would have to reorganize our resources to allocate staff there. In addition, over 1,750 students who have not attended, whether remote option or in person, And that's over 600 to date that parents have signed off for homeschooling. And about half of that number is close to full-day kindergarten students who have not attended. In addition, the transition that Superintendent Bill Torrens just talked about, the number of parents who've made the choice, that alone, if we were just addressing the third factor, which is how many parents are now transitioning, that alone would still require movement of staff from in-person to remote, but not as complex as this. I wanted to reiterate, as we have communicated and spoken to the ministry around parent choice and having 3 different transitional options throughout the year, next one in January, throughout the province, directors are indicating to the ministry that this is complex and it's difficult to sustain, and it's not what we would say is in the interest, the well-being of our staff and students to reorganize once relationships have been established. In a typical year, we might have between 50, 55 to 60, maybe at 100 at the most in the past, of staff who have to change. We're in the excess of over 400 teachers who have to change their assignments, and subsequent ECEs who could be impacted as well. So as we move forward, we'll bring further parameters of what the transition will look like when we ask parents in December if they're looking at making a different choice from remote to in-person or vice versa. Right now, our best thinking is where we have room, we will honor that choice. If we don't have room, we'll have to come back to the trustees and to the ministry in terms of what additional financing might be available to open up more rooms versus reorganizing in, because we need our staff to settle in and our students to settle in for the rest of the year. So I just wanted to reiterate that piece to the trustees through the chair. Back to, I guess, to Associate Director Peter Sobran. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. So continuing with transitions in the report on 6-9, towards the bottom, there are 2 sections there that I'd like to highlight. One is on a re-engagement strategy that has been ongoing this fall. As has been noted already this evening, there are many students who have not been attending either in person or remote, and efforts have continued with personal reach outs to the families to better understand the choice and, where possible, to also problem solve around some potential alternative approaches in terms of re-engaging the student, at least at some level. I also wanted to highlight that with this substantial reorganization, in most cases, it will result in students requiring to form a new cohort, as well as staff will be engaged with a different cohort of students. There have been some questions around whether or not the changing of cohorts in some ways goes against what we've described in our enhanced public health measures. Do want to highlight that ongoing discussions with Hamilton Public Health Services has occurred in terms of understanding the change in the cohorts. As recent as this afternoon, we reached out again through Superintendent Stefanian to once again ensure that there was an understanding from our public health colleagues that this type of reorganization that has been occurring across the province, including the co-terminus board, would include the changing of cohorts. Once again, as highlighted by Superintendent Stefanian earlier, we have been reassured that while cohorting is an important part of our enhanced public health measures, it is amongst a continuum, first and foremost, beginning with the screening, the staying home if one is not well, proper hand hygiene, wearing a mask where possible, and physical distancing. And so wanted to highlight that part, as well to note that we have learned from our positive cases that students, while they may be in a particular elementary school cohort, in some cases are also part of a transportation cohort that's different with other students, that are part of a before and after school care cohort, again, that is different. And so because of those reasons, we will continue with the reorganization, and there won't be a break in between the days in which students move from one cohort to the next. I'm now going to move to section 6, still on the same slide, secondary schools, and I will just begin by providing some highlights that our secondary schools, again, have operated since the beginning of the school year in adaptive mode. That study hall, we've been reporting on study hall in the past couple of reports. And overall, we'd like to indicate that those attending study hall, there appears to be success in the implementation of the way the study halls are working in each one of our schools. They do look different in different schools. Some schools continue to have a handful of students attending study hall, while other schools have upwards of hundreds of students attending study hall. E-learning, there is no substantial change since the last report, that we do have a number of students who have opted for the full remote learning option and are continuing in that area. It's worth noting the rotational start date since the last report. We did begin rotation number 2 on October the 13th, and in the report are highlighted all of the changes in rotation dates for the remainder of the semester. I am going to turn it back to Superintendent Torrens just to briefly outline some other program notes in secondary school, particularly in terms of pathways that are worthy to note at this time. So, Superintendent Torrens.
Thank you, Associate Director Sovereign. Three quick items to highlight from the report. First is, despite being in an adaptive model, as we are right now, our Tier 3 and pathway programs continue, with specialist high skills majors specifically continuing to be in place, and students continuing to progress towards their SEALs. The second is we have begun in-community co-op placements. We started the year focused mostly on virtual placements, but we have moved to in-community placements. And third, we are working to continue to highlight pathways available to our grade 7 and 8 students, both through having virtual open houses or grade 7 and 8 nights in our secondary schools, and holding a virtual version of My Path, My Way, which has been traditionally held at La Una Station in October. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Torrens. The final section, E, under secondary schools, continuing education. Unfortunately, Superintendent Dunlop is unable to join us on the line due to the technical difficulties. So I will just, on her behalf, highlight that in the section of the report under continuing education, we want to extend gratitude to staff in continuing education for their creative solutions to offering many of these programs, whether it be international languages, strings, again, all done at a distance and virtually. You see some of the numbers in the report in terms of enrollment and engagement, and it's I'd say quite impressive in terms of their efforts and the uptake. So despite the challenges in terms of not being able to engage in person through their leadership, we are continuing to offer these programs, and it's worth highlighting. I'm going to go to slide number 6 with the heading Special Education Supports, Transportation and Technology. And invite Superintendent Peggy Blair to provide some updates around students requiring special education supports and services.
Thank you, Associate Director. So it's been an interesting few months, but we've done, I think, a really great job if I had to reflect back on the last 2 months and the smooth transition. And I think in part that has to be, if I had to say, we've never received funding from the Ministry of Education for summer programming. But this year, we did receive funding for summer programming for students, all learners. And the programs that we put in place helped us prepare for programming and ease back into school for students that require special education supports. The programs, as you know, that we offered in the summer were both remote and in person for students with a variety of learner profiles. And so what we tried to do is replicate that in the best way possible with all of our students. And so what our kind of mantra is in specialized services is support, support, support for adults and students. The support for staff that's currently underway and we found to be effective are deploying, for example, our system learning resource teachers. And so an observation would be that these resource teachers that go into either remote classes or in school are embedded in there. And it's the power of so they co-plan, they co-deliver programming, and then they reflect on the efficacy of it. And we found that to be very, very effective. And over 8 weeks, staff can start to fade support. And they do work on universal design for learning and differentiated instruction and assessment. What does it look like to assess this student that might not be attending full days in a remote setting? Other supports that they also put in place are technology. Right in the moment, what does that technology look like? What do I need to do? And perhaps new technologies for some people. So it really is about collaboration. Other supports that I think are important and that we've observed are the supports that, for example, we started in the spring. So we continue with Family Connect through our autism and neurodevelopmental team. If parents or guardians wish to have support or have their children involved, we do that remotely. So all in all, there are other things. For example, Center for Success is happening both in virtual or remote school, as well as it has to happen remotely now because we can't have people go to centers. So that staff learned in the summer what worked well for students with learning disabilities, their technology, and having that student learn to self-advocate for themselves. Other supports that we're putting in place, so for example, our child and youth care practitioners in 25 schools, we now have 5 more going into schools, so we're grateful for that, both elementary and secondary now. And in addition, additional educational assistance. So if I had to reflect back on the last 8 weeks, in large part, very positive. For students, again, we want to make things familiar. And so again, they know many of the staff, and through their resource teacher at their home school, if they're engaged in remote learning, that person is still providing outreach. And I'll just sum up to say that the 2 pillars of special education, IEPs and IPRCs, will both be done in a remote fashion, but consultation will occur, particularly around IEPs, as they go home now and in the next week with parents. They'll go home in an encrypted manner, and then parents can call the school or set up a Teams meeting to collaborate on the IEPs. So a little bit different than in our typical world, but we feel that there should be plenty of collaboration around both those pillars. So thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Blair. I'm just going to make a slight modification to our order here. and move to Section 9, Technology, and I'm going to come back to transportation and financial implications for Associate Director Zucker. So in the report on page 6-12 under technology, section number 9, just want to highlight that distribution of devices for the elementary school remote learning program has continued. As of yesterday, we had distributed over 900 devices to students to support them with their learning in the remote learning program. It's worth noting, as always, that through our 21st Century Learning strategy, that our secondary school students have one-to-one devices, and they were provided with devices, those coming into grade 9 or new to the school at the start of the year. And as well, planning is underway to determine device and connectivity needs for those students attending our elementary schools in person. This is to support, as the director has highlighted numerous times, the continuity of learning should the need arise to have an entire class, an entire school, or the potential of the entire board, once again having to move to a scenario C or remote learning. So that work is being led by Superintendent Jane McPherson, who is also on the line but unable to connect, and I'm bringing that on her behalf. So with that, the remaining two sections, Section 8 and Section 10, Transportation and Financial Implications, I'm going to turn it over to Associate Director Stacy Zucker.
Thank you, Associate Director Sovran. And for transportation, I just want to update on rotating cancellations. We did start them at the end of September, and at that time, there were 22 open routes, which means that there were 22 routes which were sharing cancellations with another 22 routes that were filled. We are currently at 14 open routes, so we have been able to reduce that number by 6, and we continue to work to reduce that number. So there are two things that happen to fill a route. We either we work with the providers and they've added drivers, or we've been able to add additional providers, or we look at reviewing all of the users of transportation and decreasing the number of runs. So HWSTS, the Hamilton Wentworth Student Transportation Services, is in constant contact with the providers to provide any support that they can to bring drivers on quickly, and also is reviewing all of the data. And as we move from in-person to remote through this transition period, there will be another period to opt in or out of transportation. So between the opting out of transportation, more remote learners, and the fact that we actually have the data now on the number of students that are actually using transportation, we are able to look at reducing more runs. So that should improve the number of cancellations as well. In addition, for an update on study halls, we have identified all the students in study halls who have access to transportation and that cannot use public transportation. And so schools will be contacting these students starting later this week, and they will be surveying them with regards to midday transportation. So once we've collected all of that data from the students, again, that are eligible for transportation in a study hall, but do not have an ability to get home otherwise via public transportation, we will use that data and determine the feasibility of providing midday transportation. So feasibility is a number of things. It's cost, it's the availability of drivers, and we will look at equity as well. And if we do are able to provide midday transportation, we would be looking at November for sometime in November for a start date. So I will stop there with transportation, and I will move on to the financial section. So for the financial section, I think most importantly what I want to say is that We do go through this, and these three areas have been updated in significant detail at our Finance and Facility Committee meetings. And the most recent one was on Thursday, October 22nd, where we talked in detail about the use of reserves and about the updated enrollment and the impact on the budget. So I'm going to just highlight these areas at a very high level. But again, there are links here to the Finance and Facilities reports that will give you more detail. And when the reports come forward at the next board meeting, there'll also be another opportunity to ask questions. So as the director mentioned, and as trustees will recall, on October 24th, the board passed a motion to use up to $9 million of its reserves in order to reduce in-person class sizes focused on kindergarten and grades 4 to 8. And this would allow for physical distancing in the classrooms. At that time, when the motion was passed, based on the enrollment at that time, the projected enrollment, and based on the number of students that we projected to be in person versus in remote learning, the average class size was projected to be approximately 21. So as we've heard, more students moved from in-person to remote after that time. And we've also had a decrease in enrollment from our projections. So at the time of reorganization, the board did not have to use the entire $9 million, but the board has used right now approximately $7.5 million of the reserves to add 78 teachers and 14 DECEs above the revised budget. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, the revised budget would mean that we're talking about the budgeted staffing based on the new enrollment numbers. So that would be lower by the 1,750 students. And would then, so obviously is a lower starting point than the projections. And the other part that I just want to mention, and for trustees who attended Finance and Facilities on Thursday, you may notice that it is a different number than we had talked about there. And that's because at the time that we were meeting on Thursday, Exec Council was also meeting to do a final review of all of the really important sort of critical points where we were looking at, did we need to add some more staffing in those areas? And we did add 12 teaching positions and 1 DEC position from the information that was presented at Finance and Facility on Thursday. So that's where you will see a difference. So again, even though we haven't used the entire $9 million, we, because of the fact that there are more students that are in remote learning than we had projected, and because of the fact that our enrollment is less than projected, we still do have an average in-person class size of 20.6. So in all areas, in kindergarten, in grades 1 to 3, and in grades 4 to 8, the projected, or the average class size at this time, at the time of, so November 3rd, when we have our reorganization, will be lower than what the board was looking at when the board motion was approved for the $9 million. So we still do have the ability to use up to the $9 million, but again, using only $7.5 million of this amount, we are able to achieve the 20.6 class size and provide the physical distancing that was required as a result of that motion. The next section would be the projected enrollment and the effect that that has on our budget. So as we know, as we've heard, our enrollment is down about 1,750 students from our projections. And our projections in the spring are used for two things. They're used for our staffing for the fall. So we would base our number of elementary teachers in our budget and for staffing purposes on those projections. And they're also used for our budget. So the GSN, or the Grant for Student Needs, is mostly based on enrollment. So as our enrollment decreases, our grants also decrease. So there were two significant impacts of having a reduced enrollment. One of them is that We would need a reduction in our elementary classroom teachers and DECEs because there are less students in kindergarten to grade 8 and therefore would require less classroom teachers. And it also is a decrease to our overall grant revenue. So both of those things had to be adjusted. The first that I'll talk about is our revenue. It decreased. Our projection for the decrease is about 15.9 million. We have looked at all of the expenses that are corresponding to this decrease in revenue, and we're projecting about a $5.6 million decrease in expenses. Again, this number is lower than the number that was presented at Finance and Facilities because we added additional staffing after the fact. So that leads to an overall deficit for 2020-21 currently, and again, this is a projected deficit. We still have to do the actual calculations and a review of everything and use the EFIS forms to calculate revenue exactly. It leads to an overall deficit of 10.3 million. So what does that mean? Well, 7.5 million trustees have already approved the use of to reduce class sizes. And so we will, as we continue to look at our revenues and expenses, we will bring back a report to Finance and Facilities in November. But the 7.5 million, the use of the reserves has already been approved by the board. That additional 2.8 million would require an additional board motion to use additional reserves to cover that amount. And it's not just 1.3 million, the amount over the 9, because the use was very specific by trustees that it was to reduce class size. And the extra 2.8 is a result of decreased enrollment, which are two different things. So we will continue to review the revenues and do those calculations. We will continue to review all of the expenses to make sure that we've captured all of the reductions in expenses that will happen in 2020-21. And then we will bring back a report to Finance and Facilities in November. And again, if the board is going to pass a deficit unrelated to the board motion, then we will require an additional motion at that time in order to use more of the deficit or more of our reserves. And just a reminder to trustees that the ministry allowed for a 2% use of operating, 2% of operating budget or revenue, sorry, to be the maximum amount of reserves that we could use. And for our board, that's approximately 11.8 million. The last section is just the COVID-related funding and expenditures. And again, we do provide reports to Finance and Facilities to provide the detail related to this. But the board has received approximately $10 million in additional funding related to COVID. We have at Finance and Facilities, and the link is in the report, provided where that funding would be and has been spent. And we will continue to track and update the board through Finance and Facilities on a regular basis. So that was just a high-level description of the changes in finances, and there is significant detail that is presented on a regular basis to Finance. Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Peter.
Thank you. And so through the chair, just at the end of the report on 6-13, just a reminder as per the motion of the board that we will be back with another report providing an update at the November 23rd board meeting. So with that, Chair Johnstone, we'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with trustees in the room. And I am going to remind folks to try and stick to our 5-minute rule. So if you can try and have your questions put into that, that would be fantastic. And I'll start with Trustee Danko.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'd like to thank staff for the detailed report. I could have many questions, but I'm going to just focus in on what we've learned about reorganization, as there's been a lot of feedback from the community and from our families expressing concern about such a massive reorganization. And when appropriate, I do have a motion to reaffirm our commitment to spending $9 million or up to $9 million on in-person class sizes, but I'll hold that. Relating to the reorganization, I just want to acknowledge, one, the work that staff has been doing, and this sounds very complex. It's massive compared to what we've done in other years. I also want to acknowledge families' concerns about it, and I think we've heard from staff mention that we try to have a caring adult for every student in our schools, and by shifting teacher assignments at this point, we know that will disrupt relationships and it will remove sometimes the caring adult for a student, and we have to reestablish a new caring adult for a student. So I guess my first question for staff through the chair is, do we have any particular strategy that we plan to use to help reestablish the important relationships between students and teachers when students do have to shift classes?
Director?
So thank you. Through the chair, I'll begin. Then I'll also ask superintendents to add in, especially when we talk about the learn, disrupt, rebuild opportunity. So thank you, Trustee Danko, for the question, because I've heard from parents over the weekend that is their greatest concern right now. We know, like I said, we might deal with 50 to 60 changes in the fall and previous years. And one of the key pieces of the transition time is to try to provide time for the students to get to know who their new classmates are, potentially, and an opportunity for them to get to know who their new teachers are as well in a transitional time. This is massive. So there was one strategy I'll ask Superintendent Bill Torrance to speak to about what's the transition to help support and connect, especially the teachers who are moving to remote. I'll ask him to speak to that strategy as well. And then Superintendent Stefani to speak to about when we think about learn, disrupt, rebuild, how we can capitalize on that transition when teachers are building the caring adult, the emotional coaching approach too. So first, the superintendent build around the transition support for teachers moving to remote.
Thank you, Director Figueredo. Knowing the importance of having a smooth transition to teachers replacing a long-term occasional teacher, we've actually worked to extend the long-term occasional teacher's placement for an additional day to allow a day of co-teaching and transition, and therefore provide a supportive environment for the incoming teacher to get to know their students. There'll also be, in some cases, absolutely new group of students coming into a completely new class. And again, a day of this nature provides additional support in terms of starting to build those key relationships. We'll also ensure that teachers are feeling a high level of efficacy or a belief that they can do well at the role by providing a series of professional learning opportunities for them between starting tomorrow and working our way to next Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you. And through the chair, I also appreciate that Associate Director Salverin mentioned that the changing cohorts can be a concern. That is one of our strategies to help minimize the risk of spreading COVID in our schools, and it's been successful, along with all of the other enhanced public health measures. Can I just confirm what I heard for the community, that although we are going to see cohorts changing and establishing new cohorts and new classes as we do this reorganization, that has been done in consultation with public health? And I'm assuming the major impact would be if a positive case came into our school, we might have more students during this transition phase have to isolate or self-monitor, but it doesn't necessarily result in increased risk of spread. Is that, if I could just confirm that through the chair?
So through the chair to Trustee Don Danko, that is correct. We've spoken to public health around this, and what we've learned is the cohort is so key for contact tracing. But Trustee Danko, you're correct. If there's a positive case that occurs after November 3rd, and we are asked to provide a list of who this positive case person has been in contact with, and if it overlaps the two cohorts, in other words, they were present in this classroom A, and then they were present in classroom B, that might mean that two classrooms or two cohorts might have to be sent to home until public health contacts each of those. So that would be a ripple effect of the cohort change because we have to contact trace where a positive case has been in contact with students directly. So through the chair.
Thank you. And again, I really want to acknowledge what we've heard from the community and from families, and that there is a 1,400 or more person petition to ask us to stop the reorganization. And I want to just say to the community that I wish we could. I wish we could just maintain our classes as they are. I know students sound very happy when I pass by schoolyards. They finally have a new normal. But unfortunately, without additional funding from the ministry, it's absolutely impossible. I want to highlight that we don't normally spend our reserve funds, and trustees have committed funds. And I would appreciate if the chair could come back to me later just to reaffirm our commitment on that through a motion. But without additional funding, we simply cannot maintain the level of staffing given the reduction in our funding coming from the ministry due to enrollment. On that piece, I also would like to make a motion about requesting funding from the ministry, and I'll ask that the chair maybe come back to me on that one. Thank you.
So just to note for all trustees that will come back for two motions, one regarding board's use of funds, and the second with regards to an appeal to the ministry. So I'm going to put those to the end of the conversation, and we'll continue on. Is there any other trustee Miller?
Hi there. Thank you so much to all staff who have worked so incredibly hard during this reopening. Thank you to families who have been extremely patient, but also who have been following daily screening, who've been doing their due diligence to make sure that our schools continue to be a safe place. I do have a few questions. I will try to make sure that I'm staying on track. Just a quick question around the mental health supports, both in person and in the remote school atmosphere. I believe it was highlighted earlier in the report that we've seen, or the staff have communicated, that there is a sort of an uptick in general anxiety. And I very much appreciate the the resources that are being made available for students to take modules, to seek out supports. But I'm wondering if I could get clarity around whether or not it would be feasible for, some clarity around whether these discussions are happening in the homeroom classes. I know that for some students experiencing this anxiety, they might not know what to call it. They might not realize, hey, I've been stressed with COVID-19. I should probably seek out some support. So I'm just wondering if there's just a general acknowledgement of the situation that COVID-19 has meant for our day-to-day, and if those conversations are continuing at the actual homeroom classroom level.
Director?
So thank you. Through the chair, I'll ask Superintendent Stefani to speak about the importance of the modules we've created around Learn, Disrupt, and Rebuild, building a community of care that our educators have helped develop. Because one of the key modules is exactly to address this, the impact that COVID-19 is having on our students' well-being. So to Superintendent Stefanian.
Thank you to the trustee for the question, and through the chair. Extremely important question, because we do know for everyone, our students, our staff, those of us who are in the room, we're all responding to COVID-19 in different ways. And we know that it's extremely important to validate how students are feeling and to continue to engage in the conversations. So a couple of things. First, I'll speak to what the director referred to, and that is our first module of learning entitled Learn, Disrupt, and Rebuild. So those are lessons that are from kindergarten through to grade 12. Well, the first set of lessons really focus on the enhanced public health measures, importance of hand washing, hand hygiene, and physical distancing, all the things we've spoken about. There are a number of lessons specifically intended to engage students in conversations around understanding and recognizing their feelings, validating how they are feeling during this time, There's lessons specifically around understanding what's the difference between an everyday normal feeling about COVID versus a feeling that is overwhelming and impacting how you live your life. Notice and naming your emotions. Listening to others, empathizing with others, how to practice self-care. Those are just some examples of what are very explicitly addressed in the modules that are covered. And while our indication to staff is that they should be covered through the months of September and October, we've also indicated that this is going to be cyclical. We need to continue to go back to the learning and to support our students through that process. The other piece, of course, is the broader strategy that we adopted as a board and began our work on last year with respect to emotion coaching, and the work that we're undertaking with staff this year to continue the implementation of emotion coaching and validation, but specifically within the context of COVID-19 and how we know our young people in our schools are feeling and how best to be able to support them. So it is not a conversation that happens and then doesn't happen again, but we know that we need to continue to leave the door open and provide opportunity for our students to be sharing how they're feeling. The other piece that I'll add is we do continue to share with students that if they do feel overwhelmed, they can speak to an adult, a caring adult in their building, and there continues to be our HWDSB Helps app as an availability. So if someone is feeling that they'd like to reach out, but they're not sure where to reach out, that's always a resource that they can access both online, by phone, or through text.
Follow up?
No, not on that subject. Thank you so much for that. It's wonderful to hear all of those resources made available for our students. Moving now to the questions around reorganization. Thank you to staff for working extremely hard on this. I would love to just get a deeper understanding of what the reorganization is going to look like on the ground level, specifically if we're going to be discussing later in this meeting on how we continue to access our reserve funds and where that money needs to go. I would like just to hear from staff, how is this reorganization affecting our high priority schools and our high priority communities, and what can be done and discussed at this table in order to stabilize those schools that perhaps have seen a significant amount of changes and are going to be navigating perhaps less flexibility in their school structure to make room for new enrollments, families that maybe are moving from one area to another but still need in-person support. So if I could just get a deeper understanding of that, please. Thank you.
Director Figueredo, if you could please respond to the questions regarding high priority schools. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you through the chair and to Trustee Maria Felix Miller. Last week we discussed, we looked at the number of schools being impacted by closing a classroom. So where a teacher's assignment was going to be shifted somewhere else. Out of our 84 schools, only 9 schools last week were not impacted, just to give you the data on that. And when we looked at the data of how many in our high priority schools versus non, we were closing about 3.75 classes average in our high priority schools versus about 1.75 in our non. So at that point, the senior team discussed with the school principals, the superintendents reached out to discuss, even though we know that the class average in the high priority schools was still being a little lower than the rest, we were still concerned on the number of caring adults that would be displaced from that school and the amount of student movement that would occur as a result of losing that. So they did go back, as you heard Associate Director Zucker speak to principals about the impact, and then we added, I think it was 11, if I look at Associate Director Zucker, I know it's in the report, I believe it was 11 additional classroom teachers to the high priority schools, but again, that was from the reserve funding. So if you look at the reserve funding up to 9 million, we at this point have spent up to 7.5 million of that. So So we're going to have to continue to monitor. We have, so currently right now, like I've indicated, why HR staff has been working with our principals, communicating with principals in schools to start to begin that shift of declaring people surplus, letting them know what their options are, and working with our union partners around this, because it's pretty complex to make sure people land in a place where they're also qualified to teach. And you heard Superintendent Bill Torrance speak if they're moving to remote, which might be a new area to support them with that. But as we move forward between now and the next transition, what we need to continue to is monitor the impact, making sure our social workers are also ready to support. In addition to what you heard Superintendent Stefanian say around the resources in schools, we also want to make, around the modules and education for our teachers, we also want to make sure our social workers, like they have always been, are aware that if there's more intense supports required in the schools, our certified behavior analysts as well, our teams are ready to support our students in those schools. But as we move forward, though, we need to re-engage the 1,750 who have not come. And if we do, we know that that will provide an opportunity to look at more resources. If we receive students who come back, that'll allow us to add more teachers, because we'll then receive more funding if we re-engage students. The flexibility we'll need as we move between now and then is we want to make sure that we have access to some funds if staff needs the flexibility. Like we do in any other year, we sometimes keep contingency lines, extra teacher lines where we see hot spots that might occur. When I say hot spots, I mean this classroom is getting too big. There's too many students. This year, it's another element. It's not only the size of the class, it's the 1 meter distance that we need to monitor as well. So what we want to do is have some flexibility to add additional teachers throughout if we see people re-entering or we're seeing that there's some challenges. And our first attempt at that was last week when we looked at our 20 high priority schools and we added back, I believe it was 11 teacher positions, didn't declare the people surplus to address that first wave. So our process has begun. So through the chair, that's how we're going to be addressing it and hoping we have access to some funds to provide some flexibility, either if not through the reserves that are still available, and continue to advocacy to the ministry. We know there's also 15 million of the 50 million second wave of federal funding through the province that has not been allocated to the province. 35 has been allocated to Peel, York, Toronto, I believe in Ottawa, and the school boards in that district. So we're still awaiting that amount, and that might provide us some flexibility to address if students are returning or potential movement through the next transition as well. So through the chair.
Any further questions?
Thank you so much. I do very much appreciate staff's openness to listen, but also to really engage that direct connection between our administrators at our high priority schools and to having an ongoing conversation around this issue. I will just make one more question, but then let somebody else speak. In terms of the transition come January, a question I have been sitting with is whether it's feasible to eliminate this transition. If we do manage to make it so there's a bit of flexibility for new enrollments in the winter with our averages and with our potentially accessing or receiving additional funds, I do wonder whether or not we could reconsider this, because I'm very concerned that if we have space, footnote on this transition, I just don't know how we will necessarily implement it equitably across the board for all of our students. How will we decide who gets the spaces if there are spaces? Perhaps that's more of a comment. I don't know if staff will have an actual answer for that, but maybe it's just a comment for tonight.
Director Figueredo.
So thank you through the chair, Trustee Miller, Felix Miller, for bringing this forward. I too have, after I've been speaking to teachers and parents last week and this weekend, wish we didn't have to do this. If we had been funded on our projections, we would be in a different situation, maybe to shift some to remote because of the increase, but it would be a lot would be a lot less minimal change. So unfortunately, we've been told over and over that we have to submit our compliance class size by October 31st. The ministry said they will continue to look at what they can do, but until, and then we've received to continue to move forward through the process. I think what's an important piece to your question as we enter the transition, let's get the data first. Let's get the data in December. What I'm not comfortable with, as you hold me accountable, is another reorganization, because that would disrupt relationships yet again. And I heard from staff who've moved, can we get confirmation that we can stay in this current position until now in June for our own well-being so we can support kids? I think we need to gather the data and then see how much movement there is and what would that potentially, how would we address it from a first step is, do we have room and spaces? And then after that, what would it cost to address the other needs in terms of potentially opening up rooms? What I would say is let's get the data first to address that. I don't support a reorganization, nor does our collective agreements allow us to as one of our guiding principles. But the risk we would have of not honoring, we don't know what the influx might be. So if we said no today and we saw that there was, I'll use an example, 600 more people wanting remote, and we said no, and then they walk away from our organization, the risk is we could lose an additional millions of funding with 600 students. So let's gather the data, let's be strategic about it, but let's understand that reorganization, the impact would not be in the interest of students and staff right now.
Follow up?
No, just thank you. That's a very, very important point. I would hate to put us on track for even less funding, but thank you. I appreciate the director's comments, and I'm all done.
Thank you. I have student trustee Hessler.
Thank you, and through the chair. So, at the beginning of the school year, many transgender and queer students were outed to their peers, and this was as a result of their legal names being displayed on the MS Teams platform. So I was wondering how the MS Teams platform has been adapted to better a seamless transition for queer and transgender students.
Director Figueredo.
So thank you to the question, student trustee. I will ask Superintendent Bill Torrens or Sharon Stefanian if they're aware of that, but the question around, has Microsoft Teams, the platform, been adapted for our transgender and queer students? And that's an important equity question, so thank you. So to one of the superintendents, so I'll start with Sharon first and then maybe Bill Torrens. Thank you.
So thank you to the student trustee for the question. It is extremely important to us that we do not out any of our students through any of the processes that we have in our schools, and so are completely apologetic that in the transition of systems, we know that there were instances where that unfortunately happened. We have been working with our IT department as well as with our social worker who is assigned specifically to provide support for the system around supporting processes, procedures, and systems, specifically in support of our Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ student population. They have been working on a resolution within the hub to prevent that from happening again. So thank you for the question, and my colleague may want to speak on the hub specifically.
Thank you, Superintendent Stefanian, and I will be taking this away again. We were aware this had happened in some cases in the past. We also need to ensure that we're reviewing the information provided in our student information system in regards to the student, that we do have them properly identified. So any of our student information systems do not inadvertently out a student.
Any further questions?
Yes. Thank you, and through the chair. So my next question pertains to how the rotational model will be adapted for the winter weather. So this is just into concern for places for students to put their coats, and as well to reduce the amount of students who are also outside, and that is prior to the start of schools. That's all.
Thank you. Director?
So through the chair, so thank you to student trustee Ethan around our secondary model rotational and the transitional time. I just want to, I'll ask Superintendent either Paul Denemy to speak to our model and the transitional time. I think you've raised too concern about the time and outside and transitions, correct? Thank you.
So thank you, and through the chair. The secondary ad hoc, which consists of many principals, myself, and Superintendent Dunlop, continue to review as we transition and go through the model. We are committed to continue to look as we move through the rotations and move also through the months and heading into the winter months to review what lockers look like, what space looks like for our secondary students. So that will be upcoming in a future report.
Any further questions?
Thank you. No further questions or comments.
Thank you. Trustee Galindo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to echo the comments around thanking staff for taking the time to put this report together. It certainly helps me understand where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. Quite frankly, it feels like we're reading a history book that's taking place as we're reading it. It also is helpful for my constituents, parents, staff, students, and community members who are looking to look at what we're doing during this pandemic. So I'm appreciative of that. Just some high-level observations that I do want to comment on. Despite that we've had a total of 30 confirmed COVID-19 cases so far, I am thankful that there haven't actually been any cases that involved transmission between students and or staff within our schools. I think that means that our outbreak protocol is working. So I'm thankful for the collaboration that we have between our staff and Hamilton Public Health Services on that. I'm concerned, like Trustee Miller mentioned, with the long-term implications on the overall mental well-being of students and staff. I think that's something that we should continue to prioritize and focus on over the next few months and realistically years, just to make sure that folks have the supports that they need. I'm happy with, just give me 1 second here. Yes, with regards to the financial implications, I'm happy that we've managed to spend below the allotted $9 million that we allocated from reserve funding. So I'm happy for that. I think it speaks to the talent that we have within our system. But I'm still frustrated with the feeling that we've been left high and dry by the province of Ontario when it comes to dealing with the financial implications of this pandemic. To echo the questions and comments that were raised by Trustee Danko, our hands are tied and we have to make difficult decisions and difficult choices. I'm happy to entertain the motion that I think Trustee Danko plans on introducing in a few moments. But to Trustee Miller's comments around not going through another reorganization, I agree completely. But I also recognize the need for more data. So let's see what information we can get in the next few weeks. But I completely agree. I would rather avoid yet another reorganization in January. Overall, thanks again to staff for all the brilliant and talented work that you've done so far. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have any further questions at all? sorry, I took that as more of a comment. Are you looking?
No, I'm back. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. So do we have any further questions from trustees or student trustees in the room? Seeing none, then I will move along to our trustees online. So we'll start with Trustee Archer, and I'll just let that get set up.
Concerns have been answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Archer. Next, we will go to Trustee Bingham. Just one moment, please. Trustee Bingham? Trustee Bingham? I think you might be on mute. Trustee Bingham, we will come back to you. So we will go to Trustee Buck.
Trustee Buck doesn't have any questions, but wishes to thank staff as well and echo the comments made by Trustee Danko.
Thank you. We'll go now to Trustee Deeth. Oh,
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
yes, we can. Thank you, Trustee Deeth.
Okay, thank you. I just have a couple of questions building on, I think, what some of our other trustees have talked about in regards to mental health and well-being. I have received email from school council recently, and again, hearing from more parents in regards to the students' emotional, social well-being. And so what they're reporting is that the kids are becoming more reluctant to go to school and are becoming frustrated with mask wearing, increased indoor time, etc. What I'm just wondering is, are we looking at mask breaks, or is that sort of left up to the teacher in a class by class?
Director Figueredo?
Yes, through the chair, I'll reiterate what Sharon had said, Superintendent Stefan said, and I'll pass it back to her again. Around, we know as we move into this challenging time of outdoors as a place where we're encouraging staff to bring programming. As the weather gets colder, I know it'll be more challenging to use outside time. But also in addition, we talked about what it looks like to have mask breaks, not in the classroom, but sort of in the hallway where there's still 1 meter distancing. But I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian to reiterate that, and that it is something we can continue to take away and monitor, especially as the weather changes into the winter. So to Superintendent.
So thank you to the trustee for the question, and through the chair, I'll just reiterate what our director had shared in terms of certainly as we have been in the milder weather into the fall, encouraging educators as much as possible to get students outside. Certainly we know as the weather becomes colder, that becomes more challenging, but again, that opportunity to build those natural breaks into the day where classes can go outside, students can remove their masks. Certainly within the protocols, we also encourage our educators to find other opportunities where, as our director indicated, still under supervision and physically distanced, a student could step into the threshold of the doorway, remove their mask for a few moments, and then step back into the classroom. And again, really important to normalize that type of a break throughout the day so that all students have that opportunity if they would like to take advantage of that opportunity. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that our classroom educators are certainly, as we talked about, they're engaging in and learning around self-care techniques for our students and anxiety techniques for our students through Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. And we know that our approach to emotion coaching and validation is also intended to be universal and something that can be easily applied by all of our staff who are working with students in our buildings. But that's what I would call the level 1 all strategy for students. And we know that a certain amount of anxiety with respect to situations that cause stress, COVID is a great example, is absolutely normal. So it is normal to get up and to be concerned about COVID and to think about, how will this impact me? What happens if I get sick? What happens if someone that lives in my household gets sick? Those are natural ways for our students to feel. Where we become concerned is when an individual's anxiety around a situation begins to impact their ability to be able to complete their daily functions. And when those things happen, we recognize that a young person may need an additional level of support. That support can take a variety of forms, but can always be accessed through the school social worker. So I certainly encourage, as trustees are having conversations with families, there are social workers who are attached to all of our schools. They provide our mental health support within our schools. If there are specific concerns that they have about their children, connecting in with their principal or their vice principal so that that connection with social work can be provided.
Trustee Deeth, further questions?
Thank you. I'm just wondering, through the chair, because parent councils have started up again, so I'm just wondering if this is something, conversations that can be had at parent councils that would be, we could provide maybe more information that they can disseminate to parents. Is that, or maybe even, I know in the past we've had social workers come in, so maybe attend some of these Zoom meetings that parent councils are now having. Is that something that we would consider?
Director Figueredo?
Through the chair, and I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian, but yes, if we can support school councils in terms of educating, but also having them help us support to share information to families, because as they have relationships in the community, they might hear things that might be very helpful to direct sort of parent to parent. But I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian. I believe your answer is yes with that.
Yes, so through the chair, absolutely. Social work staff are always available to connect in with school councils at invitation of the principal. We also have had public health nurses who have participated in school council meetings already this year. And I'll also share that one of our strategies that we established last year under the leadership of Manager McKillop, to my left, is a strategy that looks at HWDSB staff. I'm going to use the language of recording, but there's probably a more 21st century term for it. But creating online short snippets to talk about topics that are of interest to parents and housing those on our HWDSB website. So a parent may not be interested or able to participate in a 35 or 40-minute presentation or a workshop, but they may want to be able to access short 10 or 15-minute snippets where HWDSB staff are talking about a specific area of interest. In this case, it may be stress management during COVID-19, and that can be made available directly to parents to access when they need it. So I'll take that request offline with my colleague, and we will follow up.
Oh, thank you, Trustee Deeth. That concludes your comments?
Oh, no, sorry, I still have a few more.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, it was mentioned that we had trouble with, we got a very low student participation in thought exchange. So I understand that you're looking at ways to improve that participation. Can you maybe expand on what that would be, how you're going to encourage more feedback from students?
Thank you. Through to the director.
So thank you. I'll ask Associate Director Peter Sovern to provide insight. We know that the timing was difficult, but everyone indicates to put things off. We need to get as much information as we can at the moment we have, but I'll ask Associate Director to speak to that as he's working with research analytics about ideas for the next thought exchange.
Thank you, Director, and through the chair, that's what I would highlight, Trustee Deeth, is that we are working with our research and analytics department, and at this point in time, the data has just come in, and so The analysis of all the data is being completed. This was an initial theme that emerged where it was noted that participation was low, and so the goal is to look to ways to increase that participation. That's ongoing right now. I don't have any further details at this time.
Trustee
Thank
Deeth?
you. And I just have one more question. I know that I had spoken to the director and was looking into this, but I'm just wondering if there was any update in regards to cabs and transportation. So if students, their cab is normally takes them home at the end of the day, are they able to switch to a midday pickup?
Director?
So thank you. Through the chair, I'll ask Associate Director who oversees transportation to sort of respond to how we're trying to manage some consistency through this approach. Associate Director Zucker.
Thank you, and through the chair, when students are provided with personalized transportation and therefore usually taxi cabs as their form of transportation, the taxi company usually works with the students in order to arrange the rides. And I have heard that in some cases where required or where requested, taxi companies have been able to work with the family to provide transportation at other times during the day other than the end of the day. So we are allowing that as it is a relationship between the family and the taxi company that's providing the rides.
Oh, one moment, just one moment. Okay, start again, Trustee Deeth.
So would it be the cab companies that the parents would go to, and that's who they would get approval on the switch through?
So through the chair, my understanding from transportation services is that is the relationship that is had. So once it is determined that a student will be using the personalized transportation or a taxi for their transportation provider, the relationship becomes between the cab company and the family, and the conversations happen directly between the cab company and the family. So in the instances that I have heard of this happening, they have arranged it directly with the cab company.
Okay, thank you. And that's it for my questions. And again, thank you again to staff and all the work on this. Actually, sorry, one more question. In regards to study halls, so I know you indicated that we're going to make the decision in November, early November, and you're working on that. So will we see a breakdown of study halls school by school on who's using the study halls? Because you said it varied quite a bit from school to school.
Director Figueredo.
So thank you to the chair. We are gathering the data right now through superintendents and then principals to find out which students who are staying in study hall are eligible for transportation and would rather have transportation midday versus the end of the day. So we are collecting it by school, and then feasibility of it, I think, is what Associate Zucker had said, is if we do explore, can we afford the midday runs? And I think it's easy to think, well, if you're not offering it after school, just offer it midday. It's not as clean as that, because sometimes the after school run is connected to other runs within a route. So as we knew before, when we looked at it across the district, it was about $2.5 million if we went midday runs across all our secondary schools from September to December. So we are going to explore that. We are looking school to school, and then we will look at if it's feasible, if we have the funds. In light of what we've just learned around declining enrollment here, it's another pressure point. So we will bring that back once we have the information through Associate Director Zucker.
Okay, thank you. And in regards to the study halls, Have we received feedback, and I'm assuming maybe this would be part of the thought exchange, but have we received feedback on how students are finding the study halls?
Director?
So through the chair, I'll ask either Superintendent Denemy if he has information, and I don't know if any of those themes have emerged yet in the initial themes of the thought exchange. I know when the further analysis gets done, we did ask 3 thought exchange students in elementary in-person, elementary remote, and our students in our secondary adaptive model, which is all of the students. That might come out in the analysis, but right now in the initial themes, that's all we have. But I'll ask if Superintendent Denemy has any more information than that from his conversations with his team and the principals.
Thank you. And through the chair, at this time, we don't have any additional information regarding study hall thoughts through the thought exchange. It is at a local level right now where teachers and principals are working with their current student bodies on the study halls that they have set up and adjusting accordingly in order to support students.
Through the chair, if more information comes in through the analysis of the thought exchange, right now it's only the themes, then we'll provide that update in the full analysis if there is. So thank you through the chair.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, one final question, which is a little bit different. Have we considered flu shots through the school? Or is that with public health? Is that something that we would consider doing?
I'll move through to the director.
I'll pass this one over to Superintendent Stefanian because I know it's been a discussion point, but I'm not clear on where we are with that discussion. Superintendent?
So thank you to the trustee for the question, and through the chair, we have had conversations with Hamilton Public Health regarding flu clinics specifically. And the flu shot within Hamilton is being administered through family practitioners and also through local drugstores. So our local Hamilton Public Health, while they are messaging out around the importance of the flu shot this year as every year, they're not actually holding flu shot clinics themselves.
Okay, thank you. That's it for my questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Moving along to Trustee Tutt, and I'll just...
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Trustee Tutt exited the meeting 11 minutes ago to go pick up his children, however, expressed that he has no comments or questions.
All right, thank you very much. And Trustee Bingham?
I have her question, but I'll see if she wants to state it. Go ahead.
Trustee Bingham, can you speak into the mic for us, please?
There we go.
I hope you can actually hear me.
Yes.
I feel like there's
Yes, we
an
can.
echo
Please
that's
speak.
happening on my own phone. So it's going to be difficult because I keep hearing myself talking as well. So I wanted to go back to the students that are missing, the 1,750. If all the students came back at once, would it affect a few schools and a few classrooms, or is it across the board? All schools, all class, like a lot of different classes, or has there been a large number from one area that it would desperately affect classes or specific schools? And I am worried, such as Trustee Miller's worried as well, about the schools that need the most help, schools that need the most support. What would happen if a very large portion of those students came back all at once? Or are we talking it is across the full board? Thank you.
Director?
So thank you through the chair. Thank you for your question, Trustee Bingham. So from the analysis of data last week, we saw that out of the 84 schools, 9 schools did not have to declare a teacher surplus to their assignment. And then out of the rest of those, of the 75 schools, the 20 high priority had an average between 3 to 4 classrooms that they were shutting down. And then that's when discussion and feedback was coming back from our principals and trustees around high priority schools that we looked at adding more of our reserve funds there. And the rest of the schools, non-high priority, had about 1.5 classes or teachers impacted. To your question, if in terms of who are the students, we know in our projections in June we're conservative, but we started to see over the last 2 years an increase in enrollment in our elementary schools. So we had increased around, out of those 1,750, 300 were a projection of increase in terms of across our entire district. Those would be 300 names. We don't know who they are because they were students we were projecting as a natural increase. But when we look at the rest, we know that about half of them are in full-day kindergarten, and what we're seeing a trend across the province is because they're not mandatory school age until age of 6, grade 1, that more parents are homeschooling. And then in terms of the rest, we're seeing sort of a disbursement across all grades with, like I said, more of an intensity in the high priority schools. If they were all to return to either remote learning or in person, we would welcome them with open arms. And in terms of the impact, that would also then, we would be funded as they came back. We would not need to use our reserve funding. Our grants for student needs would then be reflected as such. So we then could add additional teachers if we felt that we didn't have room in current spots, and we would be encouraged by their return. So returning of students who haven't shown up to this date would actually help our funding grants increase as we had projected in the spring. So through the chair.
Trustee Bingham?
Okay. Would we be able to have a school-by-school breakdown by chance? It would be helpful for us to understand more. I don't know whether staff can take that back and bring it to us, or if they have it, or...
I'm seeing head nods, Trustee Bingham.
So through the chair, through my weekly director's update, I can share with the trustees in terms of how many classrooms or FTE were impacted in this reorganization. And we can also bring, I think, in our HR committee, there'll be more information coming in our Human Resource Committee. So I'll flag that for Superintendent Jamie Nunn for HR committee as well, through the chair.
Associate Director Zucker?
Thank you, and through the chair, every year in November, December, we do provide through Finance and Facilities an update on a school-by-school basis of elementary enrollment. And there is a comparison, I think it's a 5-year comparison, and plus it compares projections to actuals. So trustees will receive that as part of our regular enrollment updating.
Further questions, Trustee Bingham?
So that would be great. Thank you so much for your answer. And just thank you so much to all the staff, right from top to bottom, and to the families for their patience and everything that we need to do.
Thank you. So I have myself last on the list. First, I'd like to start with echoing the last comments made by Trustee Bingham as well as other trustees around the table to staff to thank you for all of the hard work that you continue to do. We sincerely appreciate it, and we, as does the community, in terms of being kept up to date with all of the activities that are taking place across the board in order to meet student needs and keep the health and safety of our students and staff at the front of our priorities. I do have a couple of different questions. With regards to hand hygiene, do we do any quality checks with that just to measure to see how frequently hand hygiene is occurring? Director?
So through the chair, I'll pass to Superintendent Stefanian around the expectation of the hand hygiene, and we also know that that it's being used because our hand sanitizer supply has been used quite readily. But to the superintendent around that expectation and the monitoring of it.
So through the chair, and thank you for the question. As the director said, we have outlined in our protocols the continued expectation around hand hygiene. Certainly, the preferred is washing with soap and water. However, recognizing that that's not possible at all times, and as a result, there is hand sanitizer available at the entrances to our schools and also in all of our classrooms. We have indicated that we expect students to be sanitizing or washing upon entry to the classroom, whether that's at the beginning of the day or it's entry when students are coming back in from nutrition break. Of course, should also be practicing hand hygiene before they eat any food, before and after they eat any food, and also before and after they touch any objects in the classroom that potentially are shared. So if they're going to be tossing a ball, perhaps in the gym or outside, practice hand hygiene before, practice hand hygiene after. So we've provided general guidelines for staff. And in addition, we've indicated that educators should plan hand hygiene breaks throughout the day at suitable times. So we've established the guidelines and parameters, but we haven't put into place any system around monitoring.
Just back through to the director and on the question with regards to quality check. So would we consider doing quality check? My understanding is that the hand hygiene is kind of our first line of defense in the top one. So I'm just wondering if that would be considered. Director?
Yeah, so thank you through the chair. Early this morning, I did send a school messenger out at an early time. And I think it's important when you look at the layers, the first layer, even before hand washing, is around the daily screening, that if people have symptoms, to please ensure they don't come to work. That was a message for staff, and we're going to reiterate this. One conversation with public health is that people are people are tired of the measures of mask wearing, and they said be vigilant, continue to remind them in terms of the monitoring. We're speaking to our principals around the reinforcement of this, so sort of that quality control will have to be at a school level. We'll take that away in terms of our principals around reinforcing this message. But what we're hearing is that our educators are pretty vigilant around this, not only for the safety of their students, but for their own safety. And what we're seeing is the quantities. One thing we're monitoring, we can monitor, is the shipment we're bringing in, is the volume of hand sanitizer being used, and it is in terms of our usage. So we know from that it is being used. But we'll reiterate that at the school level with our principals, and that's sort of been our campaign now that the public health is reminding us to be vigilant, because they worry about people becoming complacent. But what we are seeing though in our schools, I continue to say, it's probably one of the safest places to be because of the mitigations that people are putting in place. And the most recent cases we've been dealing with, they're not outbreaks within our schools. Unfortunately, what we're starting to see now is cases where they're contact tracing, and it's leading back to gatherings in the community. And unfortunately, 2 weeks ago was the Thanksgiving a long weekend, and that's where some of these cases are being connected back to friends and family gatherings. So we'll continue to reiterate that. And I think that speaks to what I'm proud of this, is that when we do get the positive case and we ask when's the last time a person's been at work or a student's been at school, it's usually 3 or 4 days ago, because when they had symptoms, they realized they had to stay home. And that's key. So all of these things are around quality control and monitoring and reiterating the message. And we'll continue to do that. But thank you for that suggestion as we move forward.
Thanks. And I think just with regards to that, I'll just kind of add that it would be good for trustees to just have some data. So that would be, of course, up to staff to figure out what would be provided to trustees, but just in terms of whatever the quality control looks like, just so we have a sense of how hand hygiene is, I guess, being encouraged in schools and monitored. So that would be great. That does lead, your responses do lead into my next question with regards to screening. What is the average amount of days that a student may miss when they are screening and staying home?
So through the chair, I'll ask Superintendent Stefania. We haven't done we'll ask her if she has any data on that, but we know we submit daily. Our daily reporting to the ministry is key around staff or students who've reported to be absent. But I know it can range from, typically not, but anywhere from 1 day, because if they're symptoms and they become symptom-free 24 hours later, they can return. To anywhere where it is 14 days or potentially longer, because if they're not symptom-free after 14 days, they're asked not to return. I'll ask Stefania if we have that data at this point in terms of the average for students. Do we know at this point in time? But it's something we can take away and include in our next report around the average or the median days connected to potentially the symptoms related to COVID. So we can take that away.
Thanks. And just for trustees on the phone, Superintendent Stefania was shaking her head no, that they don't have, say, an average. And the reason why I'm asking that question is I noted that there was 2,811 students and 346 staff who had recorded absences. However, across the system, we had 60 cases, 21 students and 9 staff. So I just was wanting to get a sense around how many days are missed on average. And my next question with that is, do we have any concern, especially with students who may be experiencing significantly more absenteeism this year compared to other years, particularly students who may be a higher risk in terms of absenteeism in the past? Director?
Through the chair, absolutely we do. I think, like we said, we're concerned of students who haven't even shown up yet. That's our greatest concern, and what potential gaps might that create, academic gaps or social emotional gaps as well. But when we look at the absences, that's a ripple effect. As we say, please stay home if you have the symptoms. And then the ripple effect of that is the continuity of learning, especially if it's a student who may be home. And I think what we had a concern at the beginning, and you saw the ministry address it, was around one of those symptoms around runny nose. That alone was creating a great concern in October, and that feedback did go back to the COVID-19 and the Chief Medical Officer of Ontario to talk about then the 2 buckets of symptoms. And so since then, we've seen a different response, but we were very concerned if that wasn't going to be addressed, and it was addressed, especially as we enter into the cold temperatures, because every student or every individual would enter into a building with potentially a runny nose if it's cold. But we are concerned, and hence why one of our strategies is, especially if the whole cohort is asked to self-isolate, the work with Sharon and then with a program with Bill around quickly turning around remote learning and having our virtual classrooms ready. That's why it's so important in our 21st century learning strategy that every teacher adopts a blended learning model around face-to-face and around our Microsoft Teams standard platform. That's also what we heard from the thought exchange from our parents in the spring, is please don't have people, have our children experience the same home, 3 different platforms, or from grade to grade, they now have to relearn a different platform. So that's been one of our mitigations from our feedback from parents, and why program is working so close with equity and well-being to make sure that transition when students are home for a long period of time, that they have some continuity of learning.
Thank you. And then do we know at all, and if we don't, if we can just look into that, with regards to when students are missing days and they're recording absences, is it because they are awaiting test results, or if they're awaiting to find out if they are a direct contact and therefore must isolate, or a secondary contact and therefore can return to school? Do we know if kind of what's causing the recorded absences, Director?
Yeah, so so what we do know is, and I'll ask Superintendent Stefani to add to this, is when we submit our daily data to the ministry, people have to report their absences if it's sort of COVID-related symptoms. But in terms of, do we know if people are going for tests? We know that they can be recommended, but we don't necessarily know until we're informed by public health there's been a positive case. But I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian to give clarity of what we submit on a daily basis, and our principals have to submit this data daily, and then public health now has access to this data as well from the province. So Superintendent Stefanian.
So through the chair, as the director said, what we do submit daily to the ministry is where parents have indicated that their child is absent and the code that they're using is COVID-like symptoms. So we do have a specific code that a parent would use, that principals will use when they're reporting to the ministry, and that we also use when we are reporting to the ministry, because there's a dual reporting accountability that happens on a daily basis. That would be they failed the screen. They have a COVID symptom, they have failed the screen, or they may have failed the screen for another reason, but again, it's connected to COVID reasons, and that's the code that they're using. We also do track absences for students who have been directed to remain home because they have been identified as a close contact of someone who has tested positive for COVID. So both of those data sets are captured in our student information system, both those where the student has failed the screen and they're home for COVID-like symptoms, and those where they are home because they've been directed to self-isolate by public health.
Thanks. And I just noting that I'm probably approaching my time limit. So I will just kind of communicate here to the director that for the next report, it would be helpful to, if that information could be drilled down a little bit more and shared with trustees in terms of the data, how many are reporting COVID symptoms versus how many are waiting results, and then again, what the average time is. I think just because I'm trying to understand if I think that there might be some important learning here and important communications that can be shared with the ministry, especially if wait times for test results are keeping students from returning to class. Then we would want to encourage the ministry to, both the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education, to work together to get that resolved, because that would be impacting our students. And data is power. On that as well, for the next report, I'm hoping that with regards to mental health and well-being, if we could get some data with regards to whether the case numbers are up and down. I really appreciate the enormous amount of work that's being done into mental health. It was wonderful to hear all of the resources that are available. But again, it would be great to hear some more figures with regards to whether our cases are up in certain areas with regards to mental health, to truly understand or help trustees to understand what the impact the pandemic is having on our students' mental health. I'm also had another area, and again, I'll leave this for follow-up for our next report. But with regards to engagement and communications, we received some excellent feedback, and both positive and also areas that we need to have improvement. So I'm hoping we can have a communication, perhaps even directly out from our comms team, about when parents and students can expect a response in terms of how we are reflecting and making changes according to the feedback we receive. So again, I'm throwing everything in because I'm limited for my 5 minutes, but would hope to hear some follow-up on that. My last questions are, I do want to save for questions, or I do want to say them, which is with regards to the reports on remote learning, on secondary and elementary, both remote and in class. When would we be receiving some data with regards to student achievement? In particular for the secondary, I can see that we've finished rotation 1, we are on to halfway done rotation 2. When would we have some data with regards to the impact on student learning and achievement? Because I think we want to be very nimble and reflective at this time if we need to be making changes. Director?
So just to provide a clarity, but to your specific question, Student Learning Achievement Report will be coming in November as part of our strategic direction priorities. And then, as we had in previous years, we provide monitoring reports to that strategic priority to come to program committee. So we'll continue to do that as part of our practice this year through program committee. But to your other question, I just want to provide, just to see clarity, in terms of mental health support, social worker data, always honoring privacy, we can look in terms, has caseload in terms of our social worker providing intense supports increased this year? We can look at that and difference between high priority and non-high priority. In terms of thought exchange, we always have a communication follow-up and then how we're responding so the community knows. We'll bring that further analysis as Associate Director Peter has said, and then communications works for the research analytics around the follow-up. But just I want clarity around the average daily. We can bring attendance around the average daily. What we don't have access to is what someone's wait time might be, because we don't know necessarily if, from a privacy lens, whether someone is going for a COVID test or not. We are only informed once a result is positive and comes back to us. So we would not have the wait time data, but I mean, I know public health may have that data, though, but we wouldn't have that access to that. Just want to provide that clarity. Thank you.
But sorry, Director, we do have, we're able to determine if a student has COVID-like symptoms or if they have another area related to COVID. Those are the two areas that we are collecting data on, correct? So perhaps if we could have that data shared back, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, through the chair, that we can. So we can look at what the averages are for our elementary students or by division. So we'll take that data away because we report daily to the ministry.
Thank you. And Trustee Liaison Miller, am I done my 5 minutes or do I have another? Am I done? Okay. No, she says I'm not. Yes, 20 seconds. So Director Figueredo, with regards to transportation, quick question on our bus times are guaranteed now to be 30 minutes or less for our elementary, otherwise the time is canceled. Is that correct? Or can you provide clarification around transportation times? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll ask Associate Director Stacey Zucker to provide around the rotation of cancellation and our commitment around the times in terms of delays. So through Associate Director.
Thank you. And through the chair, we did look at having some parameters for choosing the runs that we would be canceling. 30 minutes was the number that we used for secondary schools. And I think it was I'd have to go back and look, but I think it was 60 minutes for our elementary schools. And that would be a regular day. So if there were something like a traffic accident or construction or something that was a one-time delay, it wouldn't mean that we would be canceling the transportation that day. There would be a late. So there may be some instances when there is unforeseen lates that are greater than 30 minutes in secondary or the 60 minutes in elementary, but those two numbers were the basis of our rotating cancellations and how we chose the routes.
Thank you. I'll just say that we may need to collect data when buses are running 60-minute late, how many students are actually being picked up, because I would imagine a number of kids would just get a ride to school, and therefore we would have a bus that was not very full arriving to the schools, and just looking at that information in order for us to help make decisions with regards to policies, with regards to bus cancellations. Okay, my 5 minutes is up, so I am going to turn now to Vice Chair Danko, who had indicated earlier this evening that she had two motions to bring forward. Can you proceed with the first motion, please, Trustee Danko?
Thank you. And through the chair, for the first motion, I would like to reaffirm our commitment to spending up to $9 million to lower in-person class sizes in grades kindergarten and 4 to 8, to support safety, including 1 meter distancing, and to address high priority schools' equity needs for K to 8. And I can speak to that when appropriate. I think Trustee Miller was interested in seconding it.
Thank you. And I saw her arm go up. So please do speak to the motion, and then I'll go to Trustee Miller next. We'll go through all the trustees, and then Trustee Danko, I'll have you give closing remarks. Okay?
Sorry, point of order?
Yes.
Can I just get the motion repeated again? Sorry.
Yep.
The motion is to reaffirm our commitment to spending up to $9 million to lower in-person classes sizes in grades kindergarten and 4 to 8 to support safety, including 1 meter distancing, and to address high priority school equity needs for K to 8, grades K to 8.
Thank you. Trustee Danko.
Thank you. Just briefly, I know we've heard the director mention that we have spent reserve funds and there's possible future needs for those funds. I appreciate that staff brought forward a summary of what has been spent to date. And to be honest, I think a lot of this work is already happening, but we also want to make sure that we continue to monitor the spending of the reserve funds that we've committed to. We want to ensure that we continue to meet our goal to ensure 1 meter distancing, to address pressure points where classes are at their maximum capacity and to provide that flexibility across our system. And we've heard that there are some additional needs that have been emerging for our high priority schools. And it sounds like staff since our finance and facilities meeting have in fact already been looking at those things and looking to address those for our high priority schools. So I appreciate that work, but I wanted to signal that trustees are committed to this, and we still believe that we can spend up to $9 million of our reserve funds to continue this work as needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Miller.
Trustee Danko has highlighted, I think, the importance of the sentiment behind our original motion to access up to $9 million of our reserves. I know all of us here at the table wish that this was coming directly from the ministry. I know that we are very concerned about the precarious circumstances this leaves us from a point of financial responsibility, but also from the sustainability and the viability of our local school systems. Our local communities thrive when our local schools are healthy, when they can answer the needs of their local populations, and also when they can plan for their futures and the futures of their neighborhoods. So I'm very much committed to maintaining this motion, and I would actually be prepared to even provide a little bit more clarity around the language with regards to high priority. I would feel comfortable directing staff to, further investigation on our 20 elementary schools that really do have exceptional and very, very particular needs. And it might perhaps is an ongoing conversation that I believe has already been started, but I would definitely welcome a deeper dive in that realm. I don't have any other specific questions, but I very much support this motion.
Thank you. So is that sounded more like a statement, but are you looking for a bit of a response as well from staff? I'm going to send, because I think you had your questions answered earlier this morning, this evening, but just the last, your last statement.
Sure. So sorry to interrupt, but I wonder whether or not staff would require clearer language around exactly how they can access the reserve funds for high priority stabilization in those communities.
Thank you.
If it's needed, if not, otherwise the motion could remain as it's described.
So Director Figueredo, you've heard comments around the table tonight, but do you need any more clear direction within the motion with regards to high priority needs schools?
So thank you through the chair. If this motion passes, what this provides is further clarity that if we're dealing with equity issues in our high priority schools to meet student needs, it's not only in K and grade 4 to 8, it also, if passed, K to 8 is also telling us to make sure we continue to look at grades 1, 2, and 3. and to ensure that we could spend up to the 9 million as needs emerge between now and the next transitional point as well is the clarity I'm seeking if this motion's passed through the chair.
So Trustee Miller, it does sound like Director Figueredo is confident with the motion, but do you have any further comments?
That's acceptable for me. Thank you.
Thank you. So I am going to go to the speakers list for trustees not in the room. So those online. Do we have Trustee Tutt back with us by any chance? No. So we'll go next to Trustee Deeth. And I'll just give a moment for that to get set up. Trustee Deeth, do you have any questions? Or wish to speak for or against the motion? I think you're on mute, Trustee Deeth.
Sorry, I was just having problems getting back onto it. No, I support the motion, and I am having actually difficulty hearing as well, so I'm not hearing everything. So I don't have any questions at this time, but I do support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. And the motion was also emailed out to trustees earlier today. So, but we'll speak directly into the mic. Trustee Buck, we have up next. Trustee Buck?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Trustee Buck does not have any questions or comments about the motion.
Thank you. Next, we have Trustee Bingham. Trustee Bingham, do you have any questions for the board? And we'll need to have the mic turned on. There. Trustee Bingham?
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Trustee Archer, do you have any comments, questions, or speaking for or against the motion? Trustee Archer?
I fully support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to trustees in the room. Looking around. Thank you. Trustee Galindo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to echo the comments that Trustee Danko and Trustee Miller made, I support the motion. Again, we're in a tough financial position. I have serious concerns around how we're going to manage our financial situation in the next few months without further support from the province. However, I also recognize how important it is that we spend these funds now. So for that reason, I support the motion.
Thank you. So seeing no other hands, I'll add myself as second last because Trustee Danko will provide closing. So I'm speaking for the motion. I think that it adds some additional detail from compared to our last motion back in August, at the end of August, where we approved the expenditure of $9 million from our reserves. So not only does this reaffirm our commitment to continue spending that money, as to date we've only spent $6 million, but it also helps us to refocus with a particular equity lens on our high priority schools, as well as focusing on those classrooms that would be experiencing significant increases following the reorganization. I appreciate that staff have paced spending the reserves for moments like these when we're encountering reorganizations so that we can continue to adjust and stay committed to lower class sizes and ensuring safety by where possible, ensuring that there's a 1 meter distance between students in our classrooms. So with that, I will save my remainder comments for the next motion, and I certainly support this. Trustee Danko, would you like to close?
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you to trustees for supporting the motion. I just believe that as much as staff have done an immense amount of work to date and have spent the reserve funding well to support our students across our schools, it's important that we continue to have some flexibility in the system. It's important that we continue to identify where there are emerging needs or urgent needs, in particular in our high priority schools. And it's important to identify and be able to react where we might have some pinch points, perhaps growing class sizes at a particular school where we need to step in and address it. So I just hope this provides staff with the flexibility to do that going forward until the next transition point. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to go to a vote, and we'll have a reverse, correction. There was an expenditure of 7.5 million to date, not 6 million. So I'll just correct myself there. So we'll go to a vote now. So I'll look to see if there's anyone voting against the motion electronically. Do we have any trustees online that are voting against the motion? Speak now. Hearing none, I'll now turn to those in the room. Do we have any trustees voting against the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes unanimously. So thank you, trustees. Trustee Danko, you have a second motion. Please speak to it.
Thank you. This one you wouldn't have seen by email. Just in response to the news that we've received tonight about our funding, and based on what we heard in Finance and Facilities last week, I would like to move that we write a letter to the ministry urgently to request 3 things. 1, to request our share of the $50 million in federal funding from the Ministry of Education to support student safety as community cases of COVID-19 rise in Hamilton. 2, to request that the ministry fund our GSN based on our projections instead of our October 31st actual enrollment, similar to the spring count on March 31st that they did not change our funding based on actuals as of March 31st. And number 3, to request that the ministry increase funding for sick and replacement costs related to COVID-19, as we have already seen 346 staff absences relating to either failing screening or positive cases or other isolation requests.
Thank you. And I'm looking for a seconder. Trustee Galindo. Trustee Galindo, would you like to speak?
Hold on.
Oh, sorry, one moment. Trustee Danko does need to provide the opening. So Trustee Danko?
Thank you. And just briefly for trustees, I think it's really important, one, that we bring this to the ministry's attention as soon as possible. I know that through the directors' meetings with the ministry, through the chair and directors' meetings with the ministry, this concern and these questions have come up. But the ministry has not made any commitment to increase funding in any area. And we know that the federal government in particular has allocated funding to the province of Ontario for education, of which $35 million has already been spent on another 4 boards. We do have an increase of cases in Hamilton, and there hasn't been any response to that. On the second item regarding asking the ministry to fund our GSN based on our projections, we are in a time of great flux. We don't know if some of our students will be rejoining us. And in order for us to be able to have some level of consistency in our system, some level of normalcy, it would be really helpful if the ministry could fund us based on our projections for the first half of the year, and we can then revisit our actuals on March 31st. For the final, I also wanted to mention that the ministry has directed us to provide choices for families and to honor the parents' and families' choice. And the projections relate to an associated cost. We've had additional temporary staff allocated. We have some students who haven't shown up in our system, but there's also that cost that's associated with developing a remote school, having lower class sizes than we even budgeted for to begin with, that we need to recuperate. And then last is around the sick and replacement costs. We know this is also a COVID-19 cost, and the province did indicate that we could put forward those costs. I think it's important to highlight now that we are expecting to have higher than normal sick or absence-related costs and therefore replacement costs. And so if we can signal to the ministry clearly what our needs are, I'm hoping that they will be responsive. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Galindo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think out of respect to the work that staff is doing, and at the end of the day, we owe it to our constituents to make sure that we're advocating for these changes. So I absolutely stand with the Chair of Finance and Facilities in supporting this motion, and hopefully we can get some action out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll do, for those in the room, do we have any trustees or student trustees in the room? Please raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Seeing none, I'll go to the phones. Trustee Archer, do you have any questions or comments to the motion?
I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Bingham, do we have any questions or comments to the motion?
I'm not sure I'm even on anymore.
You're on.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I do support this motion.
Thank you.
I will support this motion. No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee. We have next is Trustee Buck.
Trustee Buck doesn't have any questions, calls the motion common sense.
Thank you. Trustee Deeth.
Sorry. Sorry, same really comments as Trustee Buck. It makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And have we had Trustee Tutt return at all? No, thank you. So I have my comments for second last. Of course, Trustee Danko will provide closing comments. So I'll start by stating that as I previously stated in Finance and Facilities this past week, boards are in a very difficult position. At HWDSB, we have withdrawn over $9 million in reserves to keep class sizes low and to recognize and respond to local needs with regards to higher community spread of COVID-19. As we plan for the months ahead, it's important to have this motion not only to go to the government to seek additional funding because we need to keep a diligent eye on ensuring safety and as well as student learning and achievement by actively implementing measures to mitigate disruptions to our classes and to ensure that we're able to keep class sizes low. We must plan to navigate the pandemic as a marathon and not as a sprint. As such, we need to consider that the additional staffing and resources that will be needed for not only the 2020-21 school year, but also into the 2021 and 2022 school year. Fiscally, we need to further consider how we use our reserve funds, as well as how we plan for the likely event of passing a deficit budget in the spring ahead. These decisions should not be made lightly. We must always show fiscal responsibility by planning to stretch out these funds over an 18-month period. However, it's also important to note that it is wrong that school boards have been driven into debt and have been required to use our reserve funds in order to ensure safety and social distancing and to continue to provide high quality education by minimizing disruptions. This debt will be repaid by cuts to future programs, and it's wrong that the health and safety of students and staff today comes at a cost of student programming tomorrow. We need the government and particularly the ministry to commit to our current students and to ensure that they are not falling short on their current responsibility. And that is why I'm supporting this motion, as I think that a clear communication to the ministry with clear examples of why we need additional funding, and while the funding that has been provided thus far is much appreciated, it still falls short. And we need them to join us in helping to respond to our local needs, as it is becoming increasingly difficult for school boards to shoulder the pandemic. So with that, I will certainly be supporting Finance Chair Danko's motion. Vice Chair Danko, would you like to give closing comments?
I think that you summed that up beautifully, Chair Johnstone, so I will leave it there, but thank you to trustees for support.
Thank you. So we'll go to a negative vote. For those in the room, is there anyone voting against? Seeing none. To those on the phone, if you are voting against, please speak up. Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you, trustees. So with that, moving along in the agenda, we'll now be moving forward to item 7, monitoring report.
So thank you, through the chair. As trustees can see in their package on page 7-1, we are bringing a monitoring report, and I'll pass this Superintendent Estefanian to go through the report. We also know we have Johanna Otete, our Equity and Human Rights Officer, online, I believe, and Jason Rizza as well, our Principal of Safe Schools. The reason this report is coming back to trustees, as per the motions last spring, following the last motion in June, the trustees' firm decision on terminating the school police liaison program. There was also a motion that asked for board staff to address the gaps and review the program, what learning and what potential programs or partnerships could be developed to address the gap, and to come back in October. This is monitoring, and what you'll see in this report is that we haven't completed that work. As a result of our good intention, the work has begun. So what trustees will see in here is clearly, as a result of that motion, what has been terminated as a result of the school liaison program. In addition, what is still being engaged in terms of the safe schools legislation, what is still required. So more clarity on what is required around safe schools. What have we gathered short term? And then long term, what will be our structure, our task force to complete this review as we address any gaps that might occur, and what are the timelines situated to this continued review. So on the notion of the termination, the trustees asked us to do follow-up work. I'll pass to Superintendent Stefanian to provide sort of high-level review of this monitoring report. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Figueredo, and I am pleased this evening to be providing a progress update to trustees related to the motion, as the director indicated, from the end of June. And I'll begin with trustees on page 7-1. Really just beginning by emphasizing how this direction really reinforces our collective commitment to equity, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and anti-discrimination work within our board. Reminder to trustees that on June the 16th, the Human Rights and Equity Advisory Committee prepared a report that came forward to the trustees with the recommendation to terminate the police liaison, sometimes referred to in our elementary schools as the school resource program, for a variety of reasons. But the main reason being that the program, which may appear to be neutral or safe for some, actually for our Black, Indigenous, racialized, and other marginalized students, the experience was very different, and for many was described as being harmful. And as the director indicated, there were 2 motions that were passed by the Board of Trustees on June the 22nd, and I'll reference those on the top of page 7-2. The first was recommending a full termination of the police liaison program effective immediately. And then there was an amendment that staff review and gather input on the police liaison program, as well as alternative supports and programs, and staff identify gaps with respect to student, staff, and community to identify next steps for developing a replacement program and reporting back to the trustees. So the report this evening is an update on progress related to those 2 motions. So first, I just want to reinforce and share with trustees that subsequent to that meeting on June the 22nd, the next day, we communicated with our Hamilton Police Services, and the police liaison program within HWDSB was terminated and continues to be terminated within our schools. In addition to that, I'll walk through some of the short-term actions that staff have undertaken as a result of that direction and where we are currently at with respect to the second motion from trustees. So one of the first questions that we began to hear surfaced from our school administrators, our principals and our vice principals wondered about questions related to what was specifically being terminated with the termination of the police liaison program. I will remind trustees that we had in HWDSB a police liaison program which was separate and distinct from the local police school board protocol, which is a requirement by legislation that every board in the province have. There is a requirement that with respect to safe schools and secure schools, that there is a protocol that exists between local police and school boards. So the activities that continue in our schools are only those activities that are required by legislation. They are connected to safe schools or secure schools, but nothing beyond that. So our first step, as I mentioned, is principals had a number of questions. So we asked principals as we were heading into the summer to let us know what their questions were or what they were wondering about as we were approaching September. We were very clear that this work would have two stages. The first stage would be ensuring that we were providing clarity for our administrators in terms of what would continue in September and what wouldn't continue in September. And the second stage would be to look at how we work with community to plan forward to address any gaps that may exist at the school level. In gathering questions from administrators, they really fell into one of three categories. The first category would be communication, and we would describe that as something that would be short term. So as an example, we had questions from principals such as, in the past, I may have contacted my liaison officer to find out specific information related to a question that a parent had shared with me around custody. There were a variety of different areas that administrators had identified as wondering how they would communicate going forward. What if I wanted to speak to someone about traffic within my school community? What if I wanted to speak to someone about specific questions with respect to careers in policing? So there were a number of different questions that our administrators had that we summarized as being communication-based. And subsequent to that, we met with representatives from Hamilton Police Services to work through the various areas of communication. We then, in turn, shared information back with schools in readiness for September, so principals knew who to call in order to access information. We wanted to ensure that if there was a mandatory call, they knew when to call 911. We wanted to ensure if there was a call that required a police response by legislation, but not immediate and urgent, that they knew to call the dispatch number. Principals also identified what we would define as both short and long-term learning needs, and so we are currently in the process of completing the learning plan for administrators. The first stage I'll talk about this evening. And then longer term was the question around programs and supports. So if police were providing presentations, as an example, on cyber safety, how long-term would that need be addressed? And those are questions that will be answered through the process that staff will be undertaking with community. So as I mentioned, based upon the initial questions from administrators, we provided our administrators with their first phase of learning, which includes a presentation that will be delivered in November, and it's outlined on page 7-2, the content that administrators have asked about. There's nothing new in terms of approaches, in terms of what trustees are seeing. This is clarification and is part of the work that lives in legislation. But we know that we wanted to provide clarity for our administrators in these areas. I will highlight that the content of the presentations was put together by administrators for administrators, and where we have reference to supports around special education and mental health. We had our staff specifically from specialized services and from social work services supporting the material that was prepared for our administrators. And again, as I had mentioned, this learning is scheduled to happen in November. In addition, staff have developed a tracking tool that is going to be used to support the gathering of information around when schools are contacting Hamilton Police Services and the nature of the calls. This will allow us at a system level to be able to aggregate up, to look at the themes around the types of calls connected to safe schools and secure schools that are being made, and for us to look at how proactively we can plan forward and support our administrators in our schools. I'll also mention that we have met with Hamilton Police Services to provide clarity around activities that will not continue. And Hamilton Police Services has been very clear on asking staff for clarity around those activities so that things that should not be happening are not happening in our schools. And as I had indicated, the elements of the Liaison program have discontinued. Our activities are based on safe schools and secure schools. So on the bottom of 7-2, you'll see an overview of those activities that trustees would have seen in the June report that are not continuing. And the top of 7-3 identifies those areas through legislation where our administrators must contact the police. That includes not only the types of incidents that are identified on that page, but also lockdowns, bomb threats, and also connection to the Youth Criminal Justice Act. I'll also mention that the other time when police would be in schools connected to the police school board protocol and secure schools has to do with the lockdown drills and the bomb threat drills that are part of legislation. And Hamilton Police Services are part of that process because they certainly support in the event that there is a lockdown, but they also support in helping staff identify the best and most effective ways in which to respond in the event of a true bomb threat or in the event of a true imminent threat that requires a lockdown within the school. Where there will be drills happening, and where police will be present for those purposes, that information will be made public and shared with students and families in advance. So students and families will know the date and time in which those drills are happening and in which the police will be in the building to support those drills. And as I mentioned, we continue to have ongoing conversations with Hamilton Police Services around activities. Those would be what we would describe as short-term, the pieces that from our administrators we heard that we needed clarity around as we headed into the school year. I'll now move into page 7-4, which speaks to the plans around our long-term actions. And as I had mentioned earlier, this work does fit in with our equity action plan. We do have areas within the plan that speak to the school and the classroom and partnerships, as well as within the context of positive culture and well-being. So we know the foundation to the work around the next steps, and this really is speaking to the second motion that was passed by trustees. This work really needs a foundation in human rights, decolonization, anti-racism, and anti-oppression. That's the foundation and the framework that needs to be applied throughout the next steps in the process. So we're looking at establishing a community-based working group that will have representatives from a variety of HWDSB advisory committees and will be supported by staff, primarily the Safe Schools Ad Hoc Committee that we have in place. We are proposing that the working group will have membership as outlined on page 7-4. So extremely important that student voice is centered in the work that we are undertaking, and specifically student voice from existing structures that represent groups that are historically marginalized, as well as student membership that are not necessarily part of those formal structures. So we have our CC Rose group, which is our student voice group for our Indigenous students. We have Student Senate as 2 examples of existing student voice structures that we'll be reaching out to for membership. In addition, we'll be looking for student voice from other areas, as I mentioned, those voices that have historically been oppressed and marginalized. So looking for voice from our racialized student population, Indigenous, Two-Spirit, and LGBTQIA+. We see 2 of our advisory committees as playing critical roles in the process. Our Human Rights and Equity Advisory Committee and our First Nation, Métis, and Inuit Community Advisory Committee, as well as representation from Hamilton Police Services. So we would identify that group as well as staff as being the working group who would support the process that will lead to the outcomes that I'll identify on the next page. In addition, we recognize that it's important to have broader voice and perspective, and so we will be seeking feedback from the other advisory groups that are indicated on the bottom of 7-4. We recognize that if the working group became too big, it would be difficult to actually accomplish what we want to accomplish in the time frame that's outlined. But we do believe it's important that those who have been most impacted are part of the process of coming up with next steps. So on 7-5, I'll highlight to trustees the purpose of the working group, which should look familiar. It is pulled from the motion that was passed by trustees. So identifying gaps and identifying next steps for developing alternative programs and supports, and responding to the questions of what did we learn from the Police Liaison program or the School Resource Program, gathering information that has been collected formally and informally to inform next steps. We know that we already have a lot of data. We're not suggesting that we're going to go out and collect new data. We know that we have heard student voice, and we've heard student voice loud and clear. But as we collate existing data that has been gathered over time, what are we learning from those data sets that we have? What are the service gaps, if any, that have been created for our schools? So as I mentioned, I'll use the example of the presentation on cyberbullying. If historically a school has had Hamilton Police Services provide that presentation, and that's a presentation that schools believe is important to their students, let's identify it as a gap and a need, and then let's look at how we can work with community to best address that need. Who best within our community to provide that learning for our students? How do we address those gaps and put supports in place that are safe, supportive, and inclusive to all students, especially considering the needs of Black, Indigenous, racialized students with special needs and students who identify as Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+. So again, very, very important that as we're thinking about how we address the gaps, we hear the voices of those who have been impacted historically the most negatively, the voices of those who have been harmed, and looking at how we put new programs in place. And number 4 is how do we ensure that we continue to work in partnership with Hamilton Police Services for our work connected to safe and secure schools and the legislated mandates that we have under the Education Act as well as the Police School Board Protocol. So the timelines for this work, in January of 2021, our commitment is to bring a monitoring report back to trustees. As our director indicated, for a variety of reasons, we're not as far along in the process as we had hoped we may have been. We have addressed some of the short-term clarifications for our schools, but now our attention needs to shift to the second motion that was passed by trustees, which is looking at gaps and next steps in addressing those needs as we move forward. So we are anticipating that in March of 2021, we will be in a position to bring a final report forward to trustees. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Superintendent Stefanian. We will start with questions. Trustee Galindo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks so much to staff for bringing this report forward for this update. I can appreciate how challenging this work must be, made more difficult by the fact that it's during a pandemic, so thank you for continuing that work. Overall, I'm happy with the direction. I agree that the foundation of this work needs to be grounded on the principles of human rights, anti-racism, decolonization, and anti-oppression. This is not a moment, it's a movement, and I'm glad that we're not throwing away our shot. I do have a few questions, and I'm going to start with the tracking tool that staff have developed. Has it been implemented? When was it implemented? And would it be possible for trustees to get a template of that tracking tool at our next report, or at the very least, the specifics of the type of information that's being collected through this tracking tool?
Yes, so absolutely.
Through the chair.
Sorry, my apologies, through the chair. Yes, absolutely. When we bring the next report forward, we can bring the data forward. The release and the training around the use of the tool is connected to the learning that administrators will have in November. So when we return to bring an update to trustees, we will have data that we're able to share.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The data would be bonus, so I appreciate that. Shifting focus over to the community-based working group, I appreciate that that's going to be created. Actually, I'll start with this question. What's the current timeline on that? I know it's a long-term action, but I'm wondering if we have an estimate of time.
Superintendent?
So through the chair, our hope is that subsequent to this meeting, we will be in a position that we will begin the process of establishing the working group. While we do indicate that that is part of long-term, I will share with trustees that we see long-term wrapping up in March of 2021 when we bring the final report forward. So the work that will happen between now and that period of time, but we would anticipate that that group would be in place by mid to late November.
Thank you. My following question is, you went through the section, but I noticed that Hamilton Police Services is, I guess the intention as it stands now is that that will be an organization that has sitting representation on the community-based working group. Can I get clarification on the rationale for that?
I'll go through to the director.
So through the chair, the rationale when the termination decision was made, how do we engage Hamilton Police Services around reflection around elements of the program? We think it's important to invite them to the discussion and the conversation, and we hope they'll take us up on that piece, but the rationale is to seek further clarity of what our gaps may be, what we have learned from the past around the program in terms to bring that thinking to the table, and we think it's important that they're part of that discussion. But I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian to add, from her team's perspective as well.
So thank you, through the chair, and just to echo the director's comments, we know that part of the motion is to look at what we've learned, and we think it's important to have Hamilton Police Services at the table as part of being able to hear from them in this process. The director has summarized it well.
Trustee Galindo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just looking at the composition of the community-based working group, there will be a lot of marginalized communities at the table that will be present. And to speak frankly, having a representative from Hamilton Police Services present at the table will create a barrier to participation to a lot of the voices that we're seeking feedback from. that's going to be a challenge that we're going to encounter if we decide to move ahead with this current structure, and in turn could have a negative effect on the type of impact, on the type of data that we collect for that reason. So there's two alternatives that I see. One is if we could form the committee and seek input from that committee prior to inviting a representative from HPS. And if that's the direction that the committee moves ahead, I wouldn't be surprised if it would be a civilian member of the Hamilton Police Services as opposed to a uniformed officer or police officer. The alternative could also be that we just move Hamilton Police Service over to the list below that in the same category as the other community partners that we're going to be seeking feedback from. Personally, I don't think it's necessary to have them at that table. But at the same time, that won't prevent us from getting feedback from them, is kind of the point that I'm trying to make. So I'll allow staff to take that away as feedback unless they want to make a comment on that. But I will move on to my next question, which is a simple...
Just before you do, because I think that's important. So Director Figueredo, with regards to how we might approach some of the concerns that have been identified tonight, if you can just share how staff would, you don't have to have the exact solution tonight, but just if you can confirm that you would be taking that away to have those considerations, Director?
Yeah, so through the chair, right, Trustee Galindo's comment, he's put a challenge in front of staff, is how do we make sure that voices are heard and that if presence if someone's presence could impact the voice of our marginalized, racialized community. He's challenged us to make sure we take that away to consider what's the best way to make sure that that doesn't occur, and we will take that away to, because that's an important lens to look at. So thank you for that challenge, and we'll take it away with the planning committee to consider the best way to achieve that goal.
Thank you. Trustee Galindo, please continue.
No, and just follow up on that comment as well. We could always continue discussions offline if it's helpful to staff. No, my final question was answered by Superintendent Stefanian around the impact of the pandemic on the long-term and short-term, but I'm glad to hear that March 2021 is when that will be completed, at least scheduled as of right now. Thank you. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next on the speakers list, I have Trustee Miller and then Trustee Danko.
Thank you. And through the chair, I have several comments and several questions. Thank you very much to staff for producing a very thorough report here and some future guidelines. So a nice schedule and clarity around community engagement. Unfortunately, I have to say I find this report a bit lacking in what I wanted to see from our June 22nd meeting, which was I wanted a deeper capture of exactly what harm our student populations had experienced with this program. I know that we spoke over and over again at the table around accessing records, around how often police liaison officers were being called into schools and for what reason, and whether or not the police liaison officers were involved in school-based discipline conflict resolution, if you want to term it that. So I was hoping to see a little bit more information at this point, respectfully understanding that, of course, staff has had an incredible reopening, an incredible September and October. So I do not want to disregard the work that is sitting before us in all of these reports. But I was hoping to see a deeper understanding of exactly what folks were emailing us about in June, because it wasn't only that it was trending or sudden news, and I actually feel partly responsible because I feel like the motions came to the table when they were trending in our greater society, and And I wish that we had actually addressed this program much earlier in the year, where trustees would have had the time to look at all the information in a way that didn't feel as emotional, or, for lack of a better word, démodé at the moment. But moving on, perhaps if that's just some direction I can provide for the January report, that's one perspective. I appreciate the inclusion of the description of the staff app, of the reporting app. Will we be seeing retroactive information?
Thank you. Director Figueredo, will we be receiving, just to the question, thank you. Director Figueredo.
Yeah, so thank you through the chair. So I want to first acknowledge the comments of Trustee Felix Miller. We are not where we want to be on this process as of right now, and what you've indicated, there is data and lived experiences and stories that we will include in this piece that already exists. When in September we discussed this, we were hoping that the summer would have been a different summer, but the summer wasn't a summer that staff had time to engage as we were all hands on deck to reopen. Our commitment, though, was to bring in October, what is the plan, so trustees have a realistic timeline, what we're going to include. But you're clearly right, there is information, data around what the majority of our equity-seeking groups were telling us about their experience with this program over time. So we will conclude that information in our January monitoring report. And we know this is not what trustees, when they passed the motion in the spring, were maybe hoping would be coming in October. But we thought as staff we had to provide a realistic timeline. But we will include the data that we currently have in our January updated report, including the data you've highlighted. Through the chair.
Trustee Miller.
So a follow-up to that report, if my memory serves me, I believe that in June it was mentioned that Hamilton Police Services actually has no responsibility to give us any data that they've acquired from the police liaison program. Could I get that clarification if I am correct, if I'm remembering it as I believe? And could that be where they provide their input?
Director Figueredo.
So through the chair, before I go to Superintendent Stefanian, there is data that we're not privileged to, that we would ask that, if we're doing a review, that they would have data, and that's why I think it's an important piece to come to the table. But I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian, who's had conversations with the Hamilton Police Services prior to this around providing the short term, if she could respond to that question.
So through the chair, and thank you to the trustee for the question. We are provided with information from Hamilton Police Services on the previous liaison program. However, the data is provided across the community, and trustees will recall that the program is in 3 school boards, or was in our board, currently is in 3 school boards. So the data that we have access to is data that covers the activities and the nature of activities for the 4 boards, not specifically for HWDSB. I will share, I know the trustee had also asked about data sets specifically connected to why our schools have historically reached out to Hamilton Police Services. We are able to provide some data for trustees currently around calls that are made to Hamilton Police Services that are aligned specifically to suspensions and expulsions. We don't have data available beyond that in terms of the nature of calls. And that was one of the gaps that was identified through our conversations in the spring, and one of the reasons why staff have created a new tool that will support us in gathering more comprehensive data. And our commitment is to bring that data to trustees in the next monitoring report, but we will also build that into our annual reporting around safe schools. So trustees have that data set annually as well.
Further questions?
I think that data would be very much appreciated. I do also want to echo Trustee Galindo's comments around the community-based working group having a representative of Hamilton Police Services formally invited. I find this just very problematic. Trustee Galindo highlighted perfectly that there are going to be many racialized, Indigenous, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+ students, Black students, students that we heard from this past summer tell us over and over again that the police do not represent safety to them. They do not represent neutrality to them. They represent harm. And as controversial as those statements may be for some folks, I don't think that we can, in good faith, set up a committee where we ask people to share quite possibly some very traumatic experiences with a representative from the Hamilton Police Department. I also I appreciate very much the idea of a community-based working group, but I also think that there needs to be a way for our students who are not engaged on advisory committees, our members of the community who do not seek out representation at this board directly through advisory committees, to share with us their experiences. There are students in our schools across the city who will never sign up to be on a community advisory committee. They just won't do it. They're not going to do it. We can talk about it, and they will just not come. And if we don't offer them a different way to connect with us, we're going to be missing their voice and potentially missing some very, very hard truths. So I would love to see a concrete but anonymous and safe way for our students and our community members to communicate both their past experiences with this program, but also their hopes and their recommendations outside of a formal advisory committee. So perhaps if staff could comment to the feasibility. I understand that's a lot of work. Perhaps it could be a thought exchange or work that the working committee can take on as an independent survey. But I really do think that if we focus the majority of our engagement within, even as great as all of these committees are, within this population, I think we're going to be missing a big question mark here.
Thank you. So to the director, the question being if staff can look to create an anonymous and concrete way for students to come forward. Can you please comment on that?
Yeah, so through the chair. So again, the challenge is being put in front of us is, do we have the right structures, the right people at the table? And is there something probably missing in terms of a structure to get the voice? We will take this away to the working committee. We've learned from past practice, sometimes a survey or sometimes a very focused, group led by people might provide an opportunity for people in a brave and safe space to provide that. So we will take that away. And how do we make sure that through the groups that are represented, that we might need some specific focus groups for students who are Indigenous, for students who are racialized, et cetera. So we'll take that away. And if that adapts the timelines, we'll let trustees know in January. But I think the challenge is don't let the timeline get away of getting the authentic voice and experiences of our students and create the right structure for them to be present and to come. So we will take that away. And I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian, who's waving as well, who has some insights from the working group already.
And thank you to the trustee for the thoughtful comments and reflections. And through the chair, just a couple of pieces that I'll add to the director's comments. Certainly couldn't agree more on the importance of creating spaces that are safe for individuals, both both students and parents and members of the community to be able to engage. So I'll use a very concrete example, and I apologize that the bulleted listing under the community-based working group is a little misleading in that it suggests the way it's listed that is a single structure. And I will share with trustees some of the initial planning conversations staff have had. We have learned that in order to effectively engage voice, it is important to have the person who is leading that engagement to be part of the community. And we've also learned that it's important that groups have opportunity to give their voice in separate structures. And so while I will suggest that the Human Rights and Equity Advisory Committee and the First Nation, Métis, Inuit Advisory Committee as advisory groups would be very comfortable at meetings providing input and feedback and making suggestions on how we can approach gathering voice as an example, I'd also suggest that from experiences we've had, we know that we would not put students together in a space with community in order to have some of these challenging conversations, because that interaction and that structure, we've heard from students, can be one that silences them. So while those are key informant groups, I guess perhaps is the better way to state it, putting Hamilton Police Services as the concrete example at a table with students who are racialized, Indigenous, have perhaps or have experienced harm, we know that that would not be an appropriate structure to put in place. So to echo our director's comments, we know that, appreciate the challenge the trustees have put in front of us. We have been thinking about, well, we know these are key informant groups that are going to drive the work. We also know that it doesn't mean one structure with all of those parties at the table if we are authentically doing the work in a safe way. So I hope that that helps to explain the thinking, but certainly appreciate the trustees putting the thoughts on the table.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Just one final question around, just a clarification. What exactly is proactive policing by patrolling?
Director Figueredo.
I will pass this on to Superintendent Stefanian, please.
So through the chair, I'm going to give you, I'm going to say my paraphrase of what that is. That's language that is used by Hamilton Police Services and would be defined as patrolling to create familiarity within a community with the hope that by creating that familiarity, they are establishing relationships and a comfort level with youth who are, sorry, I might be too close to the mic or too far to the mic, youth who are within that community. That's, and again, that's my interpretation. That's not HWDSB terminology. That's Hamilton Police Services terminology.
Okay, and Trustee Miller, your 5 minutes is up, but I believe that was your, it's the question, does that complete the questions for clarification? Because that is allowed.
Yes, thank you. That was my question. I will just say one quick last thing, if I may. Just that, actually, you know what? I'll leave it there. That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I have next on the speakers list I have Trustee Danko, followed by Student Trustee Hessler, so Trustee Danko.
Thank you, and through the chair, some of my questions were already addressed twice. Actually, I have the same question about what a working committee could look like with marginalized students and Hamilton Police Services. So I appreciate the response to that from staff. My other question was around the tracking tool, and I think we will get more information about that. Thank you to Trustee Galindo for asking that question. But I think I wanted to say thank you to staff. I think that's one of the pieces we were missing. We weren't tracking that key information in an aggregated way so that we could find out where are there themes, where might there be issues emerging. The only question I have outstanding that hasn't been answered is around the I'll call them services, that won't be provided any longer by Hamilton Police Services. Are there any gaps that would need to be remedied now that we're concerned about? For example, the last one is to counsel and advise students on police-related matters on school property. Is there still an opportunity to connect a student to Hamilton Police Services if they requested it in the interim as we're working out what new community-based supports will look like to sort of bridge the gaps that we're going to determine?
Director Figueredo.
I'll pass on to Superintendent Stefanian to that question.
So thank you through the chair to the trustee for the question. When I spoke a little earlier this evening around the short term and some of those areas that we had identified as short term, it was important that those were addressed as we were heading into this school year, recognizing that there would be time as we work with the community group to identify any of the other gaps that have been created. So I would say that for the most part, the early stage gaps were really just around communication and clarity for our administrators in our schools, and those have been addressed or will be addressed through the learning that they will engage in November. The remaining gaps that exist would be gaps that would speak primarily to engagement through programs and other police-related opportunities. And until there's been the opportunity for the working group to have the fulsome review of where the gaps are and how best to work with community to address those gaps, that of course is the next upcoming stage of the work that we will be engaging in. The other part of the trustee's question, my apologies, it's just left my memory. Can the trustee just remind me?
Trustee Danko.
Thank you. Through the chair, I just had provided the one example, is there a way to allow or to connect students with Hamilton Police Services if they request it? Since we are no longer having Hamilton Police Services counsel and advise students on police-related matters. I know that was a question that came up in my school community where it had been of value to some families.
Yes, so through the chair, my apologies, and thank you for reminding me of what the question was. So part of the work that staff are currently engaged in is we are looking at the creation of a communication tool for parents. That tool will include information around those legislated pieces in which police are involved in schools. So again, there is the clarity that if families, parents, or students see police in the school, reinforcing the reasons that they would be there, connected to safe and secure schools. And part of that will be sharing information if a parent would like to connect with Hamilton Police Services in the past where they may have asked the school to do that on their behalf. Because that doesn't fit within safe and secure schools, we would direct the parent to make that connection themselves. Likewise, if a student were to ask for information where they were interested in connecting with Hamilton Police Services around a question they may have, again, we would be providing information to the student where they could make that that connection directly themselves in order to get that information.
Thank you, through the chair. I just wanted to also acknowledge the question and the answer around getting student voice. I think initially looking at the potential members of the working committee, I was a bit concerned that we would have a lot of adults around the table and that would silence student voice. So I appreciate that we're going to be looking for ways to ensure that students can be engaged in providing their feedback and input as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move on, I do need an extension. Thank you, Trustee Galindo, seconded by Trustee Maria Felix Miller by 30 minutes. Anyone voting against in the room? Seeing none. Anyone voting against online? Hearing none, the motion passes. So next on the speakers list is Student Trustee Hessler.
Thank you, and through the chair, I would just like to raise a point of So just to draw your attention to item 7-3, so under the police must be notified for the following incidents. Could you provide a definition for possession of an illegal drug? So this would just be specific to what extent this applies to vaping.
Director Figueredo?
I'll pass on to Superintendent Stefanian around possession of drugs, I think, around how it applies to vaping, especially for minors. So I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian to respond to that. If I'm looking at trustee, then that's the right question. Thank you.
Thank you to the student trustee for the question. And so just so that I am ensuring that I'm clear, it is around whether or not there is a mandatory notification for vaping to police. And so the answer to that would be no, there isn't a mandatory reporting for vaping. However, we do have an expectation that our administrators would be addressing vaping that is happening on school property.
Thank you. So I have a follow-up question to that. So my next question pertains to if a student who was doing illegal drugs then went to a guidance counselor for help, would they still have to report that to the police?
Superintendent Stefanian?
No, that wouldn't be something that they would have to report to the police.
Do you have follow-up, student trustee Hessler?
Thank you. No more questions or comments.
Thank you. So seeing no more questions in the room, I'll go to those on the line. I'll do reverse, starting with trustee Deeth. Does trustee Deeth have any questions?
Hi, sorry, I'm having trouble hearing through the chair. So are we still speaking to the police liaison committee, or are we on to something else?
We are, so we are on item 7. So that's to the entire report of item 7.
So yes, the police liaison report.
Sorry, we are still on the police liaison report?
Correct.
Okay. Sorry, I just heard a motion pass and I thought we'd kind of moved on from it.
No, sorry, the motion was to extend the meeting so we could stay up later and just.
Oh, okay, sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing. So I have a couple of questions in regards to, we talked about data and collecting data around this. So, and Superintendent Stefanian talked about the mandate of the police. So I would assume with that mandate, would they have any, evidence-based data that talks about, either the success or not the success of certain parts of the program? Is there something that they collect when they, in their interactions with youth? Is there data like that that they collect that they would share with us?
Director Figueredo?
So through the chair, before I pass to Superintendent Stefanian, there likely is data they collect. And I think the most important data we're going to have to collect is the voices of our racialized students in terms of what's the majority of our equity-seeking groups telling us around their lived experience. So the stories we're going to have to hear are going to be the most powerful, and that data would not have been captured in any shape and form by the Hamilton Police Services. But to your question, what data do they have around the program? I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian if she has insights to what they have gathered. Thank you.
Further questions, Trustee Deeth?
No, I guess just a comment is in regards to the student's voice, and which is great that we're obviously it's going to be the most important piece of this. And I just want to make sure that when we're hearing from those different racialized communities, to make sure that we are hearing from all our school communities, those communities within those communities, because when we get to moving forward with this, it could potentially look different within different communities. So when we get those voices of the different groups, just that will we be collecting them from all the different schools?
Dr. Figueredo.
So I will pass to Superintendent Stefanian, and I guess the challenge I'll put here is that in the majority decision-making model, you try to gather the voices of all, but in an equity-seeking majority decision-making model, your challenge is to gather the voices of those you haven't heard over time, and hence that's why you see the breakdown of the equity-seeking groups. This is why we brought the report initially under our equity action plan for that reason. But I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian in terms of, in terms of what participation of all schools, how that potentially may look through this process.
So, and through the chair, and thank you to the trustee for the question. And I'm going to begin by reiterating what our director just said. There are times when we are seeking voice that we need to amplify the voice of those who perhaps are lower in numbers, but who have had the greatest negative impact because of an experience. And so that is different from what many of us may be used to in terms of hearing all voices and weighting all voices the same. Equity is not equal. Equity doesn't mean that all voices are carrying the same value or the same impact from those voices. So when we're talking about this specific program, we heard voices that have already told us that they were negatively impacted, that they were harmed, and as a result, the decision was made to terminate the program. So that decision was made for a specific reason. As we continue our work, we want to learn about that program, and we want to look at how we can work with the communities who have been most negatively impacted to look at what are alternative supports and alternative programs. But as we're gathering voice, we have to be very cognizant that we are raising up the voices of those who have experienced the harm, and that we are hearing those voices the loudest, because again, equity is not sameness. And when we, as a system, address the needs of those who have been most negatively impacted, those who have been historically oppressed, and we put programs and structures in place, the benefit in the end is for all. And so amplifying those voices in the process is an extremely important part. It doesn't mean that we don't want to hear other voices. It means that our challenge as staff is to ensure that we are taking those voices that, to our director's comment earlier, we don't always hear, and those who have been impacted the most, and we raise those voices up. I think it was Trustee Galindo who made a comment earlier this evening around a movement and where we are in history. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Black lives matter and continue to matter. And even though we may not be seeing headlines that we were seeing several weeks ago, we can't lose sight of the voices that we've already heard from our student population. And we don't want to re-traumatize, and we don't want to re-victimize. We have voice from racialized students, and we have voice from our Indigenous students. we know that we need to be responding to those voices in order to address those gaps. So appreciate the ask around gathering the voice and recognizing it's important, but the challenge to staff is to ensure that those voices that we need to hear are amplified in how we go forward and address the gaps.
And Trustee Deeth and to all trustees, just before I continue, Trustee Deeth is, we can also take this away for a trustee information session on how staff can collect voice and input from the community from an equity lens, just to better understand that. Because I think that just being mindful of the time tonight as well, that there's some stuff in here that perhaps needs some more education and more unpacking. And as a board of trustees, we can certainly work to provide that through a trustee information session. So Trustee Deeth, do you have further questions?
No, and I think, like again, I'm sorry, I'm struggling here with the sound here, but what I was talking about was making sure that we do hear from those students who have been impacted the most and who have had, who have had bad experiences through this. But what I'm just saying is that make sure that we find those students in all communities, because they must exist in all communities. It's, not just in a certain area within Hamilton, that those stories must exist. Those students who have been the most adversely affected or struggle with the, worried about their safety, that kind of thing. So what I'm saying is just make sure you hear those same voices that you're talking about, but just make sure that they're in all communities. That was my point to it.
Okay, and I see a head nod from the director. I think that Director Figueredo.
So thank you to the chair. Thank you for that clarity, Trustee Deeth. We have to make sure that what our biases may be, conscious or unconscious, that we're looking for the voices who've been impacted the most in all communities and not make assumptions. So thank you for that clarity.
Any further questions, Trustee Deeth?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving along, do we have Trustee Buck, questions, comments?
Yes. Are you able to hear me?
We sure can.
Okay. Well, it sounds a little weird now that I've not got it on speaker, but I will try my best not to get distracted by the sound of my own voice jumping back into my ear. So my first thought when I read this report was the only interactions that students will ever have with police in one of our schools are now only going to be those negative ones listed on page 7.3. And I am a little bit sad about that. I look at that other list and I saw opportunity, and I am still sad that that's not going to be a part of the reality. An education tool, really. All that to say, I am glad that safety is paramount and that, oh, sorry, it's just jumping back. I'm going to try something. So I am glad that safety is paramount in all of this. I also, the other thing that jumped out to me when I read this report earlier was the advisory committees. I would have liked to see those worked into the community-based working groups a little bit more tightly. I think that there's valuable opinions in each of those. I've sat on 3 of these committees so far in the past 2 years, and the work that they do is so amazing, and their perspective is far-reaching, and so I would like to see that more tightly developed, but I do understand the points that the superintendent and the director had around that. I did just have a point of clarity. Is it that the Hamilton Police Service is unable or unwilling to share any data that they have collected?
Director Figueredo?
So the question was, is Hamilton Police Services unwilling to share the data, or they don't have the data? Just around quick clarification on the data they have in terms of what they're willing to share or not.
Yes, so when the other trustees had talked about data earlier, it wasn't clear to
Sorry. Trustee Buck, I think Superintendent Stefanian has a response. Superintendent?
So through the chair, the trust, just for clarification, my apologies because I couldn't hear. The trustee is asking specifically about the data sets that we have for the 4 boards and whether they can be made available for HWDSB specifically.
Trustee Buck?
Yes, I would care a little bit more deeply about our own board, but there might be value in understanding how it works for the other 3. But no, just kind of going off of what Trustee Galindo and I believe it was Trustee Danko had mentioned earlier, that the data that Hamilton Police Services would have collected on their end, do we know if they would be willing to share that? I think that it's valuable as we look into fully understanding the impacts of this program. Or are they just unable to share that data? Is it sensitive? Is there something that would restrict them from sharing?
Superintendent Stefanian.
So thank you, and I appreciate the trustee in clarifying and her question and appreciate the question. So with respect to the effectiveness of the program or the impact of the program, we can certainly ask Hamilton Police Services if they have anything currently. My recollection is the last time we asked, and it probably was a year ago, could be a year and a half ago. At that point in time, they didn't have impact data or outcome data, but happy to go back and ask the question again. With respect to the data that they do report on annually that combines the 4 boards, again, certainly happy to have the conversation as part of what we're engaging in with them. I'm not sure that they have the data broken down by individual boards. I haven't seen the data set that they have available. What I do have is how it has been publicly reported in the past, but certainly open to having further conversations with them.
Trustee Buck?
Thank you for that, Superintendent. I do have another question related to Trustee Deeth's line of questions just a few moments ago. I understand that piece of we're looking at this from an equity lens, and we're trying to understand the experiences of our racialized community or our racialized students in regards to having police on school property. And just from the way the answers to Trustee D's questions were worded, I felt like we were saying we only were interested in hearing from racialized students who have had negative experiences with the program, with police officers. Is that in fact true, or are we looking for the voices of all of our racialized students who have had either a negative or a positive experience?
So, Trustee Buck, I will turn to staff, but I also, I'll just reiterate that I think there's an opportunity for an information session about how we collect community voice and feedback from an equity lens. But Director Figueredo, can you please provide clarification? Thank you.
So through the chair, so our task ahead of us is to, as this is an equity challenge, this is an equity strategy, is to gather the voices of students from our equity-seeking groups, from our racialized indigenous, as the groups are identified here, and some will share their experiences, whether there are ones who might have had a positive experience, then we'll listen to those as well. But it is around seeking the voice of the equity-seeking groups and to understand what is the majority of the equity-seeking group telling us what's been their experience. And as Trustee Deeth provide clarification to ensure that we're looking at all communities around the racialized, marginalized, and equity-seeking groups. So we're going to be hearing from those groups as we've identified in our equity action plan. So it will be all of our equity-seeking groups and to hear their experiences.
Trustee Buck?
Thank you for that clarification. I just wanted to ensure that we were as equity-seeking groups, regardless of if it had been a positive, a negative, or even a neutral experience that they had had. So no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. And for all the trustees, I will work with the director in order to put together an information session so that trustees can receive some detailed information on how that's done and why, just to help us to understand our processes better. So I will do that. Next on the speakers list, Trustee Bingham. Thank you.
Trustee Bingham has no questions at this time and is listening, but not on my phone because it hung up.
Thank you. And Trustee Archer? Trustee Archer?
I'm not sure. 1 second.
Trustee Archer, we're just checking.
She's having trouble hearing, so no questions.
I've got no questions, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathy.
So I have myself last on the speakers list. I'll just start by asking, can staff just provide some, I guess, a question for clarification? If a student, would a student be provided with rehabilitation supports before police became involved? And I asked that question, if you could just provide some clarity, that would be great.
So I think, I'm not too sure if I understand the question, but I'm looking at Superintendent Stefanian, if you're clear on the question.
So I received the question from student trustee Hessler. However, keeping to our one opportunity to speak rule, I believe that the question's around his earlier question with regards to drug use. So would there be supports such as rehabilitation before moving to the police? And I think if staff could just provide a further explanation around the support work that we do with students first and foremost, and the harm reduction lens that we take first. Thank you.
Thank you. That's clear. Superintendent Stefanian.
So thank you for the question, and through the chair, yes, absolutely. So a concrete example is Alternatives for Youth, or one of our partners who are involved in many, if not all, of our secondary schools. If we have a school where they are concerned about drug use with a student, and the student is looking for some supports, we absolutely will work with the young person and their family where appropriate, and look at community partners such as Alternatives for Youth who have expertise in that area to provide that support for that young person. One of the things that I'll mention with respect to anything that's connected under Safe Schools, there always is an expectation that when our principals are looking at any situation, they consider mitigating circumstances. Mitigating circumstances are other things that they need to consider before they look at a formal consequence of a suspension and an expulsion. And certainly one of the things that we would expect is that if a school is having interactions with a young person over time, and each of those interactions is around drug use, let's have conversations around how we can best be supporting that young person. Who needs to be involved in supporting them? Is that support through through student success within their school? Is it support through social work? Is it support from an external partner such as Alternatives for Youth? So absolutely, those are elements that we do consider, and they're an extremely important part of providing support.
Thank you. And I guess some of my other questions tonight were around, so some of the timelines have been answered. I appreciate that. I do want to acknowledge that, although this report is not at the place that that we wanted, I do want to acknowledge that we've had a challenging year, and we recognize that, and we look forward to the further reports both in January and the final report in March. So we do appreciate the work that's being done. I did have a question around, I noted that on page 7.2, we talk a lot about how we met with Hamilton Police Services to provide clarification around when and when not police would be involved. Are we doing similar training with HWDSB staff, particularly our administrators, Director?
So through the chair, Sharon Stefanian, superintendent, will highlight what we're planning for November and what's upcoming, and so through the superintendent.
So thank you for the question, and through the chair, yes, our communication with administrators so far has clarified when they would contact police via 911 or through phone calls to dispatch. And our learning in November is going to highlight in more detail what are those areas where there is mandatory involvement, what are areas that are discretionary, clarification on the elements that are no longer happening with the police liaison program being terminated. And again, further support for our administrators around safe and secure schools. That's scheduled for November.
Thank you, because it's important that we're providing clarification on both ends, especially to our staff who are in a way, the gatekeepers, I guess, or ones who are making those phone calls. My next question had to do with, so just with regards to setting up, Trustee Danko touched on this, providing those services, identifying gaps, similar to the bullying review where we made a commitment to the community that we would not wait. I would assume that we're also acting immediately where we need to, that we would be, as soon as partnerships were identified, that those would be put into place, that we wouldn't wait until March. Director, can you please provide a response on that in terms of when partnerships and gaps would be acted upon? Thank you.
So through the chair, yes, if there's any gaps that were identified, they would have been addressed right now. But our lens was what's legislative requirement that we have to ensure is in place as soon as we open the doors in September. I'll ask Superintendent Stefanian to identify, I think, if there's any other gaps that have been identified, but we know we have many partners who have already reached out to us wanting to engage in the type of services they feel they can provide to support our students.
So thank you. And through the chair, the director has summarized it well. We have addressed gaps that have been identified already. As I had indicated, the majority of those were in communication and creating connections for our administrators to internal HWDSB resources and supports. Certainly, as we go forward and further gaps are identified, we will be looking at those community partners who are best positioned to be able to provide those supports. We have had a number of our partners already reach out indicating that they do have expertise and are interested in providing support for us. We do have pre-existing relationships, such as the relationship with John Howard, who has traditionally supported restorative processes that we have put in place. So those will continue. We are cognizant that while we do want to address the gaps along the way as they're identified, we also think it's extremely important for the committee that is doing the work to have their voice honored in terms of the ultimate direction. So once the committee has made some determinations with respect to gaps and how to best address them, staff are quite willing to move forward on operationalizing those. But we don't want to head into a direction without having the opportunity to have the voice from those who have been most impacted as part of what the next step in the next step will be in providing that support.
Okay, so but it's going to be ongoing, is what we won't be waiting, and I think that's the commitment that I was looking for. My final comment is also with regards to the Hamilton Police Services, and I want to recognize that there was certainly mixed feedback given in June in terms of the police being involved. I think my only request is going forward that we apply a lens where we're always considering who's in the room and what the impact is. I think I really appreciate the comments and concerns that came forward tonight from, I guess, from a variety of individuals. That said, if we can look to find ways to be proactive and to apply a lens up front where we're looking at what the impact might be in terms of individuals that are in a room. So I think, or how we then garner feedback and involvement, just in a way that is, I guess, from a harm reduction approach or from an inclusion approach. I don't have the correct words, but I hope that I'm clear, just so that we're always being mindful of our student and our student needs first and foremost. So that's, I see lots of head nods for those that are on the phone, so I'll leave that at that. I think that the comments were addressed earlier, but Director, if you do want to make an additional comment, that's fine. If not, that's okay. Okay, fabulous. So with that concludes my questions. This is a monitoring report, so it's, I'm just looking for a motion to receive. I'll look in the room for a motion. Trustee Danko, seconded by Trustee Galindo. So listening on the phone, is anyone voting against the motion to receive the monitoring report? Hearing none. Is anyone voting against the motion to receive in the room? Seeing none, the motion passes to receive the report. So we're now on to oral reports. Student trustees. I'll turn over to you. Do you have a student trustees report on local activities and OSTA?
Thank you, and through the chair, we present our oral report outlining updates regarding the start of students Senate and the FGM. So student trustees, Cara will start with an update for students Senate.
And sorry, my apologies. Just looking at the time, I am going to ask for another, I'm going to put it at 30 minutes. We don't have to use it, but a 30-minute extension. Thank you, Trustee Galindo, seconded by Trustee Miller. Anyone voting against online? Hearing none. Anyone voting against in the room? Seeing none, please continue. Student Trustee Zakar.
Thank you. The Student Senate aims to start this Wednesday, October 28th. We have met with Kristen Roy, the Manager of Staff Development, for support to ensure student engagement and voice for our virtual Student Senate this year.
Thank you.
And to provide an update for the OSTA ECO fall general meeting. This took place Thursday, October 22nd to Sunday, October 25th. The highlights of the conference are as follows. There was an introduction to OSTA ECO's working groups, which includes Indigenous relations, communication, French relations, student well-being, student voice awards, and advocacy, as well as environmental relations. There was a public board discussion surrounding substance abuse and racism within school boards. And lastly, there were lots of networking opportunities to collaborate with other student trustees from areas within the Golden Horseshoe region. Thank you, and this concludes our oral report.
Thank you very much. I'll look to trustees in the room. Is there any questions for our student trustees? Hearing Trustee Danko.
Thank you through the chair. Just a quick question. So was the whole AGM or the meeting with Ostago virtual? And can you just maybe share how the student said it's going to be different in terms of the format?
Thank you. Yes, the FGM or Fall Grand meeting was virtual. Student Senate this year will also be virtual, both elementary and Senate, and they'll be as normal, same times, just virtual.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from trustees on the phones for student trustees? Hearing none, thank you for your report. To the director's report.
I will be very quick. Most of the comments I've already made in the previous reports. I want to highlight the work that is the challenge in front of the senior team and our leaders. As we look at our strategic directions, tomorrow we're coming back to look at what is an annual plan that can help us narrow our focus on goals that are realistic, that really focus on an equity lens. Who are the students we are worried about the most as we look at the impact of the pandemic? And how do we go about doing that so we don't appear tone deaf to the realities of the workload that are occurring in schools? So that's the work we're going to come back at tomorrow. And then to challenge ourselves, what are the monitoring structures? How will we be able to monitor this in ways that we did before that are now being challenged because of the pandemic? So our challenge is how we're going to narrow the focus of what's realistic with a strong equity lens of our goals, and further information will come to the system by the end of November around our annual operating plan. Through the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Figueredo. Is there any questions, both online or in person? Seeing and hearing none, thank you. I'll also keep my comments for the chair's report brief. I do want to note that October is Islamic Heritage Month, and so we are recognizing that both in our school board and across Ontario. And I'll keep very high level that trustees this month have spent a lot of time being strong champions for public education. We saw that around the boardroom, particularly this evening, as we continue to find ways to look to be fiscally responsible while also holding our ministers to account when it comes to providing sufficient funding for school boards in order to look after not only our student and staff safety, but as well as ensuring high quality education and student achievement. So with that concludes my remarks tonight. Seeing and hearing no questions, with that, just before we go to adjournment and resolution into committee of the whole, I'll ask trustees on the phone to continue to stay on the line. And I'll look for the motion to adjourn and go into committee of the whole. Thank you, Trustee Danko, seconded by Trustee Miller. Is anyone voting against? Hearing and seeing none, the meeting is adjourned and moves into committee of the whole. Trustees on the line, please hold on for a couple minutes, and we'll be back with you shortly. If you want to take a bio break, please do. Thank you.